They said the Mustang was untamable. Men with ropes, whips, and years of experience had tried, and every one of them failed. Neighbors called him a killer. The sheriff wanted him put down, and even John began to doubt his own judgment. But then, something no one expected happened. A little girl with nothing but patience and love stepped into the pen, and the wild beast lowered his head. What no cowboy could conquer, she did with quiet courage. How could a child succeed where every seasoned hand had failed? The truth would leave an entire town speechless. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The sun hung low over the county auction yard, casting long shadows across the rows of weather-beaten fencing that enclosed the Mustangs brought in from the open range. Dust swirled under boots and hooves alike, carried on the sharp breeze that always seemed to sweep through just as the bidding began. The air carried a mix of hay, sweat, and anticipation. Men in wide-brimmed hats leaned against the rails, murmuring to each other, their voices low but edged with skepticism as their eyes fixed on the one horse that stood apart from the rest. In the center of the corral stood a stallion, dark-coated with streaks of mud from the mountain valleys he had been driven down from. His mane fell wild across his neck, tangled like a banner of defiance. Muscles rippled beneath his hide with every twitch, each movement controlled and deliberate, as though reminding the crowd that he was not broken, not beaten, and not theirs to command. His ears pinned back, nostrils flared, and when a ranch hand took one cautious step closer, the stallion lunged forward, teeth snapping, hooves pounding into ground with a violence that sent dust flying in all directions. The crowd reacted in unison, a ripple of laughter, some nervous, some mocking. "That one'll never take a saddle," one man muttered, pushed his hat back to wipe sweat from his brow. Another chuckled. "He's nothing but trouble. You'd sooner ride a tornado." Their words weren't cruel in intent, just pragmatic. They had seen horses like him before, the kind that carried danger in every step, the kind that would kill a man before letting him stay seated on their back. Yet this one seemed different. There was intelligence behind his eyes, not just fear or anger, but something sharper, a calculation that unnerved even the most experienced handlers. The auctioneer, a barrel-chested man with years of bark bids behind him, tried to keep the process moving. Next up, Lot 47. Strong Mustang stallion. For years, plenty of power for work if he could be trained. He kept his voice firm, but even he had to raise it over the stallion's sudden cry, a piercing sound that cut through the yard like a warning. The animal spun once in the corral, tail lashing, hooves tearing grooves into the packed earth. Men pulled their children back from the fence, and a few stepped further away themselves, muttering that no amount of strength was worth broken bones. The bidding was slow to start. One man raised his hand half-heartedly, offering a token sum, but quickly withdrew when the horse slammed into the rail in front of him, though groaning under the impact. Another potential buyer shook his head, mumbling that no trainer he knew would take the risk. Each attempt at a bid dissolved into silence, the stallion's restless pacing a reminder that he belonged to no one. Even the horses in neighboring pens grew uneasy, ears swiveling, hooves shifting nervously as if they too recognized his fury. A group of young ranch hands gathered near the far side, their laughter carrying across the dust. "Name him, Diablo," one suggested. "Look at those eyes. He'd sooner send you to the grave than plow a field." The nickname stuck instantly, whispered and repeated, until even the auctioneer used it reluctantly in his calls. "Diablo, then. Who'll take Diablo home?" But the question met only silence, broken by the stallion's heavy breathing as he shook his head, mane tossing, refusing to bow to any imagined future. Time stretched as the sun slipped lower. Buyers came and went, horses were sold and led away, but Diablo remained. The stallion's presence filled the yard, a living challenge to every man who thought himself a master of beasts. No rope had subdued him, no chute had held him long without splintering. Each attempt to mount him had ended the same way. A violent buck, a body flung to the dirt, a rider left winded and humiliated. By the time the auction drew to its end, Diablo still stood unsold, sweat streaking his sides, chest heaving, but his spirit unbroken. The crowd's voices had softened into murmurs of caution, warnings traded like gospel. "He'll never let anyone ride," One man muttered as he turned away, "Best to put him down before someone gets killed." Another added grimly. Yet for all their words, none could look away completely. There was something magnetic about him, something in the way he planted himself in the center of the corral, proud and unyielding, like a king refusing to surrender his crown. The ranch yard emptied slowly, leaving only the stallion pacing behind the rails, his defiance untouched by the day's attempts to tame him. His eyes burned with a wild fire that no rope, whip, or thread had dimmed. Diablo had rejected them all, every rider, every claim of ownership. To the men who had watched, he was a curse. To himself, he remained free. But somewhere beyond the laughter and doubt, the story of the horse who refused everyone was only just beginning. The morning after the auction, Diablo was moved to the training corral, a wider ring where the men who had stayed behind could take their chances. Word had spread quickly through town that the Mustang had gone unsold, and by dawn, a crowd had gathered at the ranch where the yard hands worked. Some came out of curiosity, others with quiet wagers placed on whether the wild stallion would finally submit. The railings were lined with boots and elbows, hats tilted against a rising sun. The murmurs of voices carried on the sharp air. Diablo stood in the center, nostrils flaring, hooves churning the dirt in restless arcs, his entire frame coiled like a spring waiting to unleash. The first rider, a seasoned cowboy named Bill Hardy, strode into corral with the confidence of a man who had broken dozens before. His face was weathered, his jaw set in grim determination. He carried the heavy rope loosely, flicking it once to test its weight, then advanced slowly, speaking in low tones as though words could tame what instinct rejected. Diablo's ears flattened instantly, muscles tightening along his shoulders. When Bill threw the loop, it caught the stallion's neck, but the victory lasted only seconds. Diablo surged backward with explosive force, jerking the rope through Hardy's gloved hands, sending him stumbling. The horse wheeled, striking out with a hind leg that caught the top rail and splintered the wood. Gasps erupted from the crowd as Hardy staggered, barely keeping his balance. He tried again, pressing closer, but Diablo met it with a furious buck that sent him flying into the dust. The men on the rails roared with laughter, some jeering, some shaking their heads knowingly. Bill pushed himself up, brushing grit from his shirt, his pride more bruised than his body. He's got the devil in him. He spat before storming out of the corral. Diablo tossed his head, mane whipping, as though he understood the meaning of his defiance. Next came Carson, taller and leaner, known for his patience. He approached with calm movements, carrying no rope, just a blanket slung over one arm. "All they need is respect," he called over his shoulder to the crowd. "You treat him gentle, they'll give back." His words drew nods from a few of the older men who respected his approach, but their confidence dissolved quickly. Carson inched closer, hand outstretched, voice low. For a heartbeat, it looked as though Diablo might yield, his ears twitching, his stance softening. But as soon as the blanket brushed against his flank, the stallion reared violently, forelegs striking the air, his scream echoing across the yard. Carson was thrown back, the blanket torn from his grasp and trampled under pounding hooves. When he crawled to his knees, the crowd was already murmuring. Even the gentle touch had been rejected. One by one, others tried their luck. Young ranch hands eager to prove themselves, older men who claimed no horse had ever beaten them, each entering with bravado and leaving with bruises. Diablo met them all with the same explosive fury. Riders who managed to climb onto his back were given no more than a second's grace before being launched into the dirt, their bodies twisting in the air, the impact knocking the breath from their lungs. The dust rose thicker with every fall, choking the onlookers, settling into creases of their shirts, and clinging to the sweat on their skin. With each failed attempt, the horse seemed to grow more certain of himself, standing taller, his nostrils flaring as though he drew power from their humiliation. By midday, the corral was littered with broken gear, ropes frayed, hats trampled, a saddle ripped from its straps. Diablo had thrown every rider, refused every hand, and made a spectacle of their efforts. The laughter that filled the air at the start had shifted into mutters of frustration, anger bubbling beneath the surface. Men who prided themselves on control could not accept that a creature of the wild would not bow to their experience. Some demanded harsher measures, whisper of spurs and whips of forcing submission. Others shook their heads, insisting that such a horse could never be trusted, that he was dangerous beyond saving. Through it all, Diablo circled the corral with unbroken rhythm, hooves pounding, tail lashing. His eyes blazed with fire that no bit of leather or iron could extinguish. He was not tired, not weakened by their attempts. If anything, he seemed more alive than when the day began, a living storm contained only by the rails that separated him from the men who sought to master him. As the sun dipped lower, long shadows stretching across the dirt, the final rider was thrown harder than the rest, landing with a sickening thud that silenced the crowd. He rose slowly, clutching his side, and staggered out of the corral, refusing to meet the eyes of those who had watched. Diablo snorted once, stamping the ground as though to claim his victory. No one else stepped forward. The men muttered, spat into the dirt, and drifted away, their anger mingled with awe. The wild horse had rejected them all, left every rider broken and humbled, and in the silence that followed, only Diablo's steady breathing filled the air, a reminder that he remained untamed, unconquered, and utterly his own. By the end of the week, the story had traveled farther than the dust carried on the autumn wind. What began as whispers at the auction yard grew into firm declarations repeated in every diner, feed store, and church pew in the county. Men who had stood at the corral and seen Diablo throw rider after rider now told the tale with an extra layer of detail, each retelling making the stallion seem larger, faster, and more dangerous than before. In the retelling, his eyes glowed red at dusk, his hooves cracked boards thick as fence posts, and his scream could be heard across the valley. Embellishment was not needed. What the horse had done was enough, but the exaggeration only cemented his reputation. In the mornings, when farmers gathered at the general store to buy nails or seed, the conversation often drifted to the stallion. "Never seen one like him," an old rancher would say, shaking his head. "He's got a fire in him that no rope can snuff out." Younger men listened wide-eyed, imagining what it must have felt like to sit on his back for the brief second before being hurled to the dirt. To some, he was a challenge waiting to be conquered. To others, he was a reminder of why wild horses were best left on the open range. The name Diablo came quickly, first spoken half in jest when a boy at the fence line muttered it after seeing the stallion lash out at a cowboy's rope. It stuck fast, repeated with laughter at first, then with respect, and finally with fear. By the time the sun set on the second day of failed attempts, no one called him anything else. Diablo was more than a name. It was a warning, a story people could point to when speaking of the limits of human control. Word carried fast along the county roads. Neighbors who had not seen the stallion themselves spoke of him as though they had. By the third day, families drove out to the ranch just to catch a glimpse of the creature in the pen. Children stood on tiptoe at the rails, clutching their mother's skirts, eyes wide at the sight of the dark stallion pacing with restless power. Even at rest, he looked ready to spring, his head tossed, mane whipping, his hooves striking the dirt with rhythm that made the boards rattle. Buyers who once might have offered good money for a strong mustang kept their distance. No one wanted a horse that refused every hand. The risk was too great. A workhorse was meant to pull, to carry, to obey. Diablo promised none of that. His presence was trouble, his reputation already too heavy for practical men to shoulder. The few who considered him weighed their thoughts in silence before turning away, muttering that a horse like that would cripple more men than he helped. Each passing day made his legend grow. A boy at school claimed his uncle saw Diablo leap the corral fence, though the story wasn't true. Another swore he had bitten through a man's glove and drawn blood. These tales piled onto the truth until the stallion became less an animal and more a myth walking on four hooves. Cowboys from neighboring towns began to ride in, not to buy, but to watch, to see for themselves a horse who had made seasoned riders look like greenhorns. The crowds that gathered were not buyers anymore. They were witnesses. At night, the ranch hands cursed his presence. He wore them down with his endless pacing, the sound of his hooves echoing long after dark. They muttered that he brought bad luck, that his eyes glowed unnaturally in the lamplight, that no fence would hold him forever. Some pressed the owner to cut his losses, to sell him cheap to a slaughterhouse before he broke another man's ribs. Others warned that even that would be dangerous. A horse like Diablo would never go quietly. Through it all, the stallion stood defiant. Every breath of rejection the roll men wanted to force upon him. The county's buyers, once eager at the prospect of owning a strong young mustang, now shook their heads before they even saw him. Fear outweighed desire. Diablo had rejected the saddle, the rope, and the whip, and in return, the county rejected him. He was left unsold, unwanted, and untouchable, his reputation galloping ahead of him faster than any rider could ever hope to keep pace. The yard was quiet after the buyers left, but the silence only made Diablo's restlessness louder. He had been moved from the wide corral into a smaller holding pen at the far end of the ranch, a space meant for unwanted stock and horses waiting to be hauled off. The rails were high and reinforced, weatherwood bolted with steel bands to ensure no animal could push its way through. Yet even here, the stallion seemed too large for space. His presence filled it, the rhythm of his pacing steady and relentless, hooves thudding against the packed earth like a drumbeat that carried unease across the yard. Every time a ranch hand walked past, Diablo's ears snapped back against his skull, his dark eyes narrowing with sharp distrust. He tracked every movement, every shift of weight, as though measuring distance and speed. His body was always angled toward escape, haunches coiled, chest lifted, the air around him alive with the tension of something that could explode at any moment. His mane clung to his neck in damp strands from sweat, and dust streaked his coat where he had thrown himself against the rails earlier. Still, there was no sign of surrender in him. Each breath came deep and deliberate, as if he was reminding the world that he belonged to no one. The men avoided lingering near the pen unless they had no choice. A boy sent to drop a bucket of water, set it down quickly, and scrambled back before Diablo could wheel on him. The horse lowered his head to drink, but never let his guard down, ears swiveling, eyes flashing upward between gulps. He drank like a creature accustomed to scarcity, yet ready to abandon even water at the hint of a threat. The bucket tipped when he struck the ground beside it. The splash soaking the dirt into mud, he stomped through as though erasing any trace of their offering. By evening, the pen was ringed with hoof marks where he had circled endlessly, refusing to stand still. The ground bore the scars of his fury. Grooves cut into the earth. The rails darkened where his hide brushed too close. Dust clung to his flanks, outlining the thick muscles that shifted with every impatient stride. His tail lashed constantly, swatting not at flies but at the unseen irritations of confinement. Occasionally he reared up, slamming his forelegs down with a force that rattled the posts, a clear warning to anyone watching. The ranch hands muttered about him in low voices. "He'll break himself before he ever lets anyone ride," one said. Another shook his head, adding that a horse that hated fences this much could never be trusted. They had seen wild ones before, but not like this. Not one that seemed to hold a personal grudge against the very idea of control. Diablo was not afraid, at least not in the way most horses feared. He wasn't skittish or panicked. His defiance was measured, steady, the kind of resistance that didn't weaken with time. As night settled, lanterns lit the yard in pale halos. Diablo's shadow stretched across the pen, his movement slower now, but no less deliberate. He stood at the far rail, head high, watching the lights flicker in the distance where the men sat on the porch, their laughter carrying faintly through the air. To them, he was already written off, another piece of stock that couldn't be bent to usefulness. To him, the fence was just another opponent, and every second he stood breathing within it was proof he had not given in. When the yard finally fell into stillness, only the crickets and the occasional creak of the rails breaking the quiet, Diablo kept moving. His hooves struck the ground again and again, a rhythm without pause. The other horses had long since settled, their breathing soft and steady in nearby pens. But Diablo's steps refused to join the night's calm. Each strike was sharp, deliberate, a warning carved into the earth itself. He was not broken, not owned, not theirs. Alone in the pen, he carried his fury like a torch, and even in solitude, his defiance burned brighter than the lantern light. The morning air carried the chill of early autumn, when John Carter led his granddaughter through the ranch gates. The boards creaked under their boots, and the faint smell of hay mixed with the sharp tang of manure lingered in the air. Lily's small hand was wrapped around her grandfather's calloused fingers, her steps light but determined. She wore a faded yellow dress under a patched sweater, Her hair pulled back into two braids that bounced with every stride. At 8 years old, she was still young enough to see the world with wonder, yet old enough to sense the weight of the silence around her. The yard, normally buzzing with men calling to one another and horses nickering, had grown quieter as they approached the far pen. John had tried to steer her toward the gentler stock at the front, but Lily's eyes were already searching, curious, intent. It was impossible not to notice the pen set apart from the others, its board scarred, its earth churned by restless hooves. Diablo paced there, his dark coat gleaming even beneath streaks of dried sweat and dust, his mane tangled but fierce like a warrior's banner. The men leaning on the fence post straightened as John and Lily approached, their murmurs rising into chuckles that carried more warning than humor. "Best keep the little one back," one man called. His words were rough, not cruel, but edged with concern. That horse will go straight through her if she so much as looks at him wrong. Another laughed softly, shaking his head. "Fool beast won't let a grown man within reach. What she thinks she'll see that we haven't." John tightened his grip on Lily's hand. He had heard these cautions all week, each one echoing his own doubts. The stories of Diablo's fury had grown with each retelling, and he had no wish to see his granddaughter anywhere near that pen. Yet Lily tugged at him, her small frame leaning toward the fence as though pulled by something unseen. "That's him, isn't it?" she whispered, her eyes locked on the stallion. John's jaw tightened. "That's him, and you'd best stay behind me. He's not safe." But Lily didn't flinch. She didn't see the bared teeth or the pinned ears as threats. Instead, she studied the horse with the quiet focus she often used when drawing, her gaze tracing every line, every movement. To her, there was no monster behind the rails. There was only an animal that looked as lonely as it did angry. She noticed the way he circled without pause, the way his eyes flicked to every sound, yet always returned to fence, as if measuring the distance between himself and freedom. Diablo stopped suddenly when he noticed her. The stallion froze, one hoof suspended mid-step, his nostrils flaring as he scented the air. His ears twitched, flicking back and forth, uncertain. The men at the rail leaned closer, expecting another violent display, another charge against the boards. Instead, Diablo lowered his head slightly, watching the girl with eyes that seemed less fire and more question. Lily let go of her grandfather's hand and stepped forward until her toes touched the bottom rail. John's breath caught, his arm reaching out instinctively, but he stopped himself. Diablo had not moved, only stared. The air between the child and the stallion thickened with a silence no one dared disturb. The men exchanged glances, their smirks fading into something else, something closer to unease. "Would you look at that?" One muttered under his breath. Another crossed his arms, frowning, unwilling to admit that what he saw unsettled him. Lily tilted her head, braids falling over her shoulders. "He's not mean," she said softly, not to the men, not even to her grandfather, but to the horse itself. "He's just sad." Her voice was light, barely more than a whisper, yet it carried across the pen. Diablo's ears swiveled forward at the sound, his body shifting in a way that looked less like defiance and more like attention. John placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, torn between pride and fear. He saw something in her eyes he had seen years before in his daughter, Lily's mother, who could walk into a pasture and calm the most restless colt with nothing more than patience. That gift had skipped him, he always believed, but it seemed to live on in his granddaughter. Around them, the men began to mutter again, brushing it off, saying it was coincidence, saying the horse was only tired. But John knew better. There was no fatigue in Diablo's stance, no weariness in the strength of his body. There was only stillness, a choice he had not given to any other soul who dared to approach him. And for reasons John could not yet explain, he had chosen to grant it to a child. Lily lifted her hand slowly, not reaching out, just letting it hover above the rail. Diablo's eyes followed the movement, his breath steady, his hooves still. For the first time since he had been dragged into the yard, the stallion stood calm, and in that moment, a shift rippled through the pen. The men who had mocked fell silent. John's doubts hardened into something more complicated, and Lily's smile bloomed in quiet certainty. She had seen something no one else had dared to look for. John's hand lingered heavy on Lily's shoulder, as though his touch alone could keep her anchored. He felt the small bones beneath his palm, the frail weight of her frame, and it frightened him more than the stallion's restless eyes. The years had taught him to read horses like men read weather, and every line of Diablo's body spoke of storms. His ears stayed angled forward, his muscles taut as bowstrings, the slightest sound in the yard making his skin twitch. To John, it was all warning, all danger waiting to break loose. "Stay back, Lily," he said, his voice firm but not raised. It was the same tone he had once used with her mother when she was small and fearless, eager to climb trees higher than her legs should allow, eager to tame colts not yet touched by rope. He had seen what boldness could cost, and he would not lose another to something that could be avoided. But Lily didn't move. Her fingers curled over the rail as though they belonged there. Her braid swayed slightly in the breeze, her eyes fixed unflinching on the dark stallion standing a few feet away. "He's not going to hurt me," she said, the words spoken with such quiet certainty that John almost believed them. Almost. He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "You don't know that. That horse has thrown every man who's dared to ride him. Strong men, men who've spent their whole lives breaking stock. He's dangerous, Lily. He's got no place for riders, no place for trust." His words hung heavy in the air, but the girl's gaze never wavered. Diablo stamped the ground once, the sound sharp like a hammer striking wood. Dust rose around his hooves, and his tail lashed against his flank. John tensed, ready to pull Lily back if the horse surged forward, but the stallion didn't advance. He held his ground, head lowered just enough to show he was watching, not charging. "I know he's angry," Lily whispered, almost to herself, though John caught every word. "But he's not mean. He's just tired of people trying to tell him what to do." Her small voice carried a wisdom that unsettled him, as though she could see straight through the surface rage to something softer hidden beneath. It was the same way her mother used to talk about horses, a gift John had never possessed, though he had spent a lifetime with reins in his hands. "You can't trust a horse like that," he insisted, his grip tightening as if he could will her to step back. His heart beat faster than he liked to admit. Diablo was not a broken plow horse, not a docile gelding for a child to pat through a fence. He was wild, unpredictable, bred by mountains and storms. Not man. One wrong move and he'll crush you without thinking. You're not big enough to stop him. No one is. But Lily shook her head gently, her braids brushing her shoulders. She leaned a little closer, not with recklessness, but with the calm of someone who felt no fear. Diablo's ears flicked at her movement, his eyes following hers with sharpness that unsettled every man who had watched him before. Yet there was no lunge, no snap of teeth, no furious buck against the rails. Only a stillness that seemed new, fragile, as though the stallion himself was trying to make sense of the child before him. John swallowed, caught between instinct and something he couldn't explain. He wanted to drag her away, to shield her, to end the moment before it turned to disaster. But he remembered his daughter, Lily's mother, standing in another pasture years ago, her hand outstretched toward a colt that no one else could get near. He remembered the same look in her eyes, the same defiance of fear, and he remembered how that colt had lowered its head, gentled not by rope or spur, but by something softer, something unseen. Still, the memory didn't ease his worry. He leaned closer to Lily, his voice lower now, almost pleading. "Please, sweetheart, don't mistake silence for safety. He's waiting. You don't know when he'll strike. Promise me you'll step back." Lily turned to him finally, her dark eyes bright with determination. "Grandpa, he's not waiting to hurt me. He's waiting for someone to see him." The words stilled him more than the horse ever could. For a long moment, he said nothing, only listened to the sound of Diablo's breathing and the steady thud of his own anxious heart. Diablo snorted, shaking his mane, but he didn't rear or strike. His hooves pressed the dirt slowly, almost thoughtfully. The men watching from a distance had expected an explosion, a charge, but none came. Instead, they saw a little girl refusing the warnings of experience and a stallion whose rage, if only for a heartbeat, seemed suspended. John kept his hand on her shoulder, the fear still there, heavy as ever, but mingled now with something else, an uneasy recognition that maybe, just maybe, She was seeing what no one else dared to believe. The yard carried its usual chorus of sounds: boots scuffing gravel, men calling to one another, the low rustle of other horses shifting in their pens. But as Lily leaned against the rail and Diablo lifted his head, the noise seemed to dim. The stallion's dark eyes locked onto hers, unblinking, steady, the kind of gaze that unsettled grown men who had spent decades in the saddle. For a moment, it felt as though the two of them were sealed off from everything else, the clatter of the ranch fading until only the girl and the horse remained. Lily stood small, her braids hanging down, her patched sweater sleeves pulled over her hands, but there was nothing small about the way she returned his gaze. Children often stare with wide, curious eyes, but this was different. She didn't look away, didn't shuffle nervously, didn't giggle the way kids did when dared to approach a dangerous animal. She was still, patient, as though she had been waiting for him all along. Diablo's ears flicked, his nostrils flared, and a ripple ran down his neck as he shifted his weight. But he did not strike the rails, did not bare his teeth, did not rear against the fence. He watched. The men nearby noticed a change, though none wanted to speak it aloud. A few exchanged wary glances, their expressions caught between disbelief and a kind of irritation that the beast they had cursed might act differently now, before a child of all people. One cleared his throat loudly, muttering something about coincidence, but his voice sounded out of place in the sudden hush that had fallen over the pen. Even the ranch dog seemed to pause, ears up, as if sensing a shift in the air. John Carter felt it too, his chest tightening as he watched his granddaughter and the stallion hold each other's eyes. He had seen Diablo glare at men with nothing but hatred, a cold fire that promised injury to anyone foolish enough to test him. But what he saw now wasn't that same fire. There was tension, yes. How could there not be? But beneath it lay something else, something he had no word for. He felt his own instincts, sharpened over a lifetime, stumble against one folded in front of him. The horse wasn't looking at Lily as prey, nor as threat. He was simply seeing her. Lily, in her quiet certainty, seemed to recognize it too. She didn't step closer, not yet, but she let her hands rest against the rough wood of the rail. Her lips parted slightly, as though she might speak, but no words came. She didn't need them. Something unspoken passed between them, carried not by sound but by stillness, by the trust that hung fragile in the air. It was a kind of moment that vanished when forced, and Lily seemed to know instinctively that all she had to do was hold steady and let it exist. Diablo blinked once, slow and deliberate, and lowered his head an inch. To the men who had fought him, it was an almost unnoticeable gesture. To Lily, it was everything. She felt her heart hammering in her chest, yet not with fear. It was something closer to awe, a realization that the wild fury she had heard about was not the whole of him. There was thought in his eyes, deep and restless, as if he were measuring her the way he had measured ropes and riders. And for reasons she couldn't name, she felt he found her different. The yard remained unusually quiet. No shouts, no laughter, just the soft scrape of Diablo's hooves against the dirt as he shifted again, still keeping her in sight. The air seemed heavier, pressing on everyone who watched, though no one dared move to break the spell. John's hand hovered near Lily's shoulder, but he didn't pull her away. Even he, cautious as he was, felt the weight of something rare unfolding before him, something he didn't want to sever with an abrupt gesture. Lily smiled then, a small, tentative smile that carried no triumph, no challenge, just a child's simple gladness at being seen. Diablo's ears flicked forward, his nostrils flaring again, and he snorted softly, a sound far gentler than the screams he had unleashed on men who tried to break him. The breath rose in a small cloud and drifted across the space between them. For that fleeting moment, it seemed as if the pen no longer separated them, as if the rails and warnings and fears of men had vanished. There was only a horse who rejected every hand, and a girl who offered nothing but her gaze, and somehow, in that silent exchange, both found something they hadn't before. The stallion, feared and untouchable, met no resistance, no rope, no demand, only eyes that refused to look away. And Lily, small in the shadow of a legend already growing too large to county, felt the stirrings of a bond she could not yet explain, but knew in her heart was real. The men at the fence had watched the strange stillness unfold with growing discomfort. They were used to the chaos Diablo carried, the violent outbursts, the bucking and the thrashing that had humbled even the proudest riders. But to see him standing quiet, ears flicking toward a little girl who barely reached the top rail, unsettled them in ways they didn't want to admit. And so, rather than face that unease, they reached for the familiar refuge of laughter. One of the ranch hands spat into the dirt and shook his head. That wild beast would kill her before letting her ride, he muttered loudly enough for all to hear. His companions chuckled. The sound, rough and careless, meant to strip the moment of its mystery. Ain't no horse alive that'll take a child on its back before it's broken, another added, leaning against the post as though he were explaining simple truth to anyone foolish enough to doubt. Their laughter rose, echoing across the yard, sharp against the quiet tension that had been holding the air. John Carter felt the words like a burr pressed against his skin. He knew these men. He had worked alongside some of them in younger years, had shared coffee with others at county fairs, had respected their skills in the saddle. But now their laughter cut deep, not because he believed their mockery, but because it spoke to the one fear he carried in his chest, that his granddaughter stood too close to danger, that the horse truly could strike at any second, and that he would be powerless to stop it. He tightened his hand around the rail, jaw set, saying nothing. He wanted to tell them to hold their tongues, to remind them that a child was standing there listening, but the words tangled in his throat. The men scoffing felt heavier because part of him still fought against the hope he had seen flicker in the stallion's eyes. It was easier to believe the mockery than to trust that something extraordinary might be taking place. Lily heard the laughter too, though she didn't move from her place at the fence. Her small shoulders tensed, her grip on the roughwood rail firm, but she kept her gaze on Diablo. The men's voices were background noise to her, the way cicadas droned in the summer, loud but unimportant. Diablo had not flinched at the sound, had not turned away, and so she would not either. Still, she felt the sting of their words in a way they dismissed her so easily, as though she were invisible except for the foolishness of her bravery. Better drag her back before she learns the hard way. One man called to John, his tone light, but his eyes sharp with judgment. Another slapped his knee, grinning at the absurdity of it all. I've seen seasoned men eat dirt within seconds. If she tries, they'll be carrying her out of here. John's face hardened. The laughter grated. But the dismissal of his granddaughter's courage stung worse. He knew they thought they were protecting her by mocking her, by making her seem silly rather than letting her get hurt. But he also knew that courage, once mocked, could be crushed if not defended. He had seen it happen too many times before. He looked at Lily, her small frame steady at the fence, her eyes still locked on the stallion. She wasn't rattled by their words, not outwardly. She carried herself with the quiet stubbornness of someone who had already chosen what to believe. The sight of it steadied John's own heart. The laughter still gnawed at him, but beneath it rose something else, something stronger. Pride. His granddaughter didn't turn away, didn't shrink, didn't even spare the men a glance. She gave all her attention to the horse that had refused every hand but hers. Diablo stamped once, a heavy thud that sent dust into the air, and some of the men's laughter faltered. They tried to recover it, chuckling more loudly, but their eyes betrayed unease. The horse wasn't reacting to their jeers. He was still watching the girl. The wild beast they swore would kill her seemed to ignore every adult in the yard. John finally let out a long breath. He said nothing to the men, not yet. Their mockery would pass like wind through grass. What mattered was in front of him, a child and a horse, locked in some silent conversation no one else understood. The laughter of grown men could not drown out what was happening in that pen, and though the sting of their words lingered in his chest, he knew this moment belonged to Lily. Their doubt was theirs to carry. Hers was a courage no ridicule could touch. John's eyes stayed fixed on his granddaughter, but his thoughts began to drift somewhere far behind the present. The dust in the air, the smell of hay, the soft creak of the fence under Lily's small hands. Each detail folded into memory. For an instant, it was not Lily standing there at all, but her mother, years earlier, a young woman with the same determined posture and the same unshaken gaze that could calm even the fiercest of animals. Her name had been Claire. From the moment she could walk, she had been drawn to horses in a way John had never fully understood. Other children her age feared the size and unpredictability of the animals, But Claire would slip between their legs and press her cheek to their warm coats without hesitation. By 12, she could ride bareback, guiding with only her legs and voice. By 16, she was handling the untamed stock her father thought too risky for anyone else. She had a way of softening even the most resistant horse, not through force, but through something quieter, a patience that spoke directly to them. John could still recall the day she had tamed a buckskin, gelding known for throwing riders. The men had gathered, much like they did now, waiting for the spectacle of another failed attempt. Claire had walked into the corral with nothing but a halter and her steady presence. Within hours, the horse followed her like a shadow. The disbelief on the men's faces had been the same kind of scoffing he heard now, laughter masking the threat of being proven wrong. Claire hadn't cared about their laughter then. She only cared about the animal in front of her and the unspoken trust they built. He remembered her laugh when she came home that night, her cheeks still dust-streaked, her hair wild, but her eyes shining. "They only see what they're afraid of, Daddy," she had said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "But horses don't live in fear the way we do. They just want to know who sees them." Those words had stayed with him for decades, etched deeper now that she was gone. The loss had come suddenly, an illness that swept through with cruel speed, leaving no time for bargaining, no chance for miracles. One day she was riding across the pastures with the wind at her back. The next she was bedridden, her strength stripped away. John had sat at her side, helpless, his rough hands clutching hers, praying for just a little more time. She had been 28. Too young, too full of life, too much a part of him to be taken so easily. When she passed, it was as though the light in the barn dimmed forever. Horses she had trained grew restless without her, as if they too sensed that something irreplaceable had been taken from them. Now, watching Lily, John felt the old ache twist in his chest. The child had never known her mother beyond stories and photographs, yet here she was, carrying the same fire, the same unflinching calm in the face of something wild. The curve of her jaw, the tilt of her head, even the quiet steadiness in her eyes. It was Claire all over again. The resemblance struck him so deeply he had to grip the fence rail harder, grounding himself against the swell of memory. He wondered if Lily knew how much of her mother lived inside her. He had tried to tell her stories, tried to paint pictures of who Claire had been, but words never seemed to hold enough weight. And now, without speaking, Lily was showing him. She was proving that Claire's gift had not vanished with her passing, but had found its way into the hands of a child who might not even realize what she carried. The laughter of the ranch hands faded into the background of his mind, drowned out by the echo of his daughter's voice from long ago. He remembered her sitting astride a restless colt, whispering softly, waiting patiently until the horse still beneath her. He remembered her telling him that fear and anger were loud, but trust was always quiet. Looking at Lily, he saw that same lesson unfolding again, as though the years between then and now had collapsed. John blinked hard, clearing the moisture that threatened his eyes. He had sworn not to let grief overtake him in front of Lily, but grief and pride were so tangled in that moment he could not tell them apart. It was as though Claire stood beside her daughter, guiding her, steadying her, reaching across time to remind him that some bonds never break. As the stallion and the child held each other's gaze, John felt the hollow left by loss fill, just for a heartbeat, with something else. Hope. Not the fragile hope of pretending the past had never happened, but the kind that whispered that legacies live on, even when the people who started them are gone. Lily's courage was her own, but it was also her mother's, burning anew. And for the first time in years, John allowed himself to believe that Claire's spirit had not left him after all. It was standing right there in the dust, in the eyes of a little girl unafraid of a horse the world had given up on. The sound of boots scuffing against gravel drew Diablo's attention before the man even reached the pen. His ears flattened instantly, his entire frame tightening like a bowstring ready to snap. The cowboy swaggered forward, a length of rope coiled in his hand, his confidence born not from respect, but from years of forcing wild things to submit. Diablo knew the type. Every line of the stallion's body telegraphed fury before the man even raised a loop of rope. With a sudden burst, he lunged sideways, slamming his chest and shoulder against the rails of the pen. The wooden boards groaned under the weight, rattling so hard dust sifted loose from their joints. The sound cracked through the yard like thunder, sending the cowboys stumbling back with a curse. Diablo's hooves struck the packed earth in sharp rhythms. His nostrils flared, and his eyes burned with a kind of rage that had no intention of yielding. Onlookers muttered and shook their heads. Some laughed, saying it served a man right for trying, while others frowned, muttering that the horse was dangerous, that no amount of patience would ever bring him around. Diablo continued to pace the edges of the pen, his body never still, as if being contained within those wooden walls was an insult he could not forgive. Every breath he took was loud and forceful, the hiss of air followed by the deep thrum of muscle and heart. To him, the cowboy was just another in a long line of figures that had come with ropes, spurs, and commands, each met with rejection. Then Lily stepped forward. She did not announce herself or wave her hands like so many others had done to establish dominance. She simply moved closer, her step small but sure, her grip tightening on the rail as she leaned in. The air shifted. Diablo stopped pacing mid-stride, his hooves cutting off their thunder against the dirt. His body froze, not in fear, not in preparation to bolt, but in a stillness that unsettled everyone watching. For the first time since the auction began, he stood without lashing out, his ears no longer pressed flat, but twitching slightly as if trying to catch a sound too faint for anyone else to hear. The cowboy muttered something about luck and backed away, brushing dust off his jeans, but his words hardly registered. All eyes were on the strange quiet that had descended over the pen. Diablo's chest rose and fell, his breathing deep but measured now, no longer ragged with rage. His dark eyes, sharp and untamed only moments ago, locked onto the little girl. She was so small, her head barely reaching the lowest rail, her boots covered in dust, her braids swinging lightly against her back. Yet something in her gaze pulled at him, an energy unlike the harshness of men who had tried to rope and ride him. John Carter stiffened behind her, his heart hammering harder than when Diablo had charged a fence. He wanted to call her back, to pull her away before the animal's mood shifted again, but he couldn't force the words out. He had seen this moment before, decades ago, when his daughter had stilled an unruly colt with nothing more than presence. Now it unfolded again, but with Lily, and against a horse that had broken every seasoned rider's pride. The yard seemed to hold its breath. Ranch hands stopped their muttering. The laughter faded. Even the creak of leather saddles in the background went still. Diablo lowered his head a fraction, his nostrils flaring as he drew in Lily's scent across the dry air. His hooves shifted once, but not in warning. Instead, it was like he was grounding himself, steadying against the inexplicable pull of calm in front of him. His muscles remained tense, but his eyes softened, just enough to be noticed by those watching closest. Lily didn't move quickly or reach out. She simply remained where she was, one hand resting on the rail, the other hanging loosely at her side. Her grandfather's warnings, the laughter of the men, even the danger pressing only feet away, all of it seemed far off to her. What she saw was not a monster or a threat. She saw a creature who had been fighting to keep himself free, who had been hurt by every hand that had reached for him, and who now, for the first time, wasn't sure if he needed to fight. The moment stretched long and fragile, like the silence before a storm. Diablo, the defiant mustang who had thrown men like rag dolls, who had slammed against rails with fury, now stood motionless in front of an 8-year-old girl. He did not rear, he did not strike, he did not snarl in his own wild way. He froze, caught in the weight of her quiet courage, as though some part of him recognized something deeper than fear or force. The onlookers stared, hardly daring to speak, while John Carter's throat tightened with a mix of dread and awe. For the first time, Diablo's fight paused. And for the first time, it was not rope or whip or threat that made him stop, but the presence of a child who saw him differently from the rest of the world. Lily lowered herself to ground without a word, her small frame folding neatly until she was cross-legged in the dust just outside the pen. Her grandfather shifted uneasily behind her, muttering her name as though it might draw her back to safety, but she didn't respond. Instead, she picked up a twig from the ground and began to drag it through the dirt in slow, looping motions. To anyone else, it might have looked like a child distracting herself, sketching idle shapes while the grown-ups talked. But there was a quiet intention to her actions, a patience that none of the hardened men around the corral seemed able to understand. Inside the pen, Diablo stomped once, a sound sharp enough to make several onlookers flinch. Dust plumed around his hooves as he shifted. Muscles coiled like springs beneath his dark coat. His ears flicked back and forth, waiting for the inevitable rope or shout that always came when humans drew near. But it never came. Instead, there was only the soft scraping of Lily's twig as it cut uneven lines into the earth. A circle, then another, a star that faltered halfway through, erased with a sweep of her palm before she started again. Her hummingbird focus seemed to rest entirely on the ground at her feet, not the restless stallion only a few yards away. The men leaning on the rail exchanged looks of disbelief. Some whispered that the girl was wasting her time, that the animal didn't notice or care what she was doing. Others muttered with irritation, their pride still sore from being thrown earlier, unable to stand the sight of a child daring to linger so close to the creature that had humiliated them. Yet as they spoke, their voices quieted. Even they could not ignore the subtle shift inside the pen. Diablo, who had paced with relentless energy for hours, slowed. His hooves struck the ground less often now, the rhythm broken by pauses, as he angled his head toward the girl in the dirt. His eyes, sharp and dark, tracked the motion of the twig, following the lazy loops and crisscrosses, as if he too was caught in the spell of her stillness. His breathing remained heavy, but the edge of fury that had always laced it began to dull. Lily did not look at him directly. That, she seemed to know instinctively, would feel like a challenge. Instead, she stayed with her drawings, letting the quiet moments stack on one another like stones building a wall of trust. At times, she brushed her hair back from her face, leaving streaks of dust across her cheek, but never once did she stretch her hand through the rails or try to call the horse closer. She simply waited. Her grandfather's chest ached watching her, torn between fear and recognition. He remembered his daughter, sitting just like that once years ago, outside the old paddock, waiting for a skittish colt to come to her. She had not forced herself on the animal, had not commanded or coaxed. It had been patience that bridged the gap. And now here was Lily, a mirror of her mother, unknowingly tracing the same path with a horse no one else dared believe in. Minutes stretched into nearly half an hour. The sun dipped lower, painting the pen in amber light that caught along Diablo's mane and shoulders, making him look almost sculpted from fire and shadow. His head lowered fraction by fraction, the tension in his neck loosening. Still wary, still powerful, but no longer driven by rage. He stood angled toward the girl, ears flicking forward, then back, then forward again, caught in a war between instinct and curiosity. The men began to drift away, muttering that nothing would come of it, that the horse was simply tired after hours of battle. But those who lingered noticed something undeniable. Diablo was not pacing anymore. He had rooted himself within the pen, his massive frame turned toward the child who had made no demands of him. His tail flicked lazily, not with irritation, but with something closer to restlessness, as if he wanted to step closer, but did not yet trust what might come of it. Lily leaned forward slightly, rested her chin in her palm, her twig forgotten in the dirt. She exhaled softly, a small sigh that seemed to drift toward the horse as naturally as the evening breeze. It carried no command, no plea, only presence. Diablo flicked his ears again, took one step closer to the rail, then stopped. Dust rose around his hoof as it struck the ground once, not as a threat, but as though to announce he had moved of his own choosing. Her grandfather felt the shift as much as anyone watching. Something subtle but powerful had begun to stir between the wild stallion and the little girl. It was not submission, not conquest, but recognition. Where every rope and spur had failed, patience had taken root. In her silence, in her simple drawings traced into dirt, Lily had given Diablo the first thing no one else had ever offered him, the freedom to decide for himself. The next morning after school, Lily was back, her small sneakers crunching softly against the gravel path as she walked with quiet determination toward the pen where Diablo waited. John followed a few paces behind, his hat low on his brow, eyes watchful but resigned. He had tried, gently at first and then more firmly, to dissuade her from continuing this strange ritual, but she had looked up at him with the same eyes that once belonged to his daughter, and he found himself unable to say no. So he walked her down, saying little, carrying the weight of worry in his silence. Diablo was pacing again when they arrived, the same restless rhythm that made the railings creak under his strength. His dark mane tossed with each sudden turn, his nostrils flaring at every stray noise that drifted from the yard. But when Lily lowered herself to the ground and crossed her legs just as she had done the day before, something shifted. His ears, which had been pinned flat against his skull, flicked forward briefly, angling toward her before snapping back. It was only a moment, fleeting and small, but it did not go unnoticed by John, whose heart skipped as though he had seen a ghost. The girl paid no attention to the watchers. She pulled out the same little stick from her pocket, the one she kept from yesterday, and began to scratch shapes into the dirt. Circles, lines, small patterns that made no sense to anyone but her. At times she hummed faintly under her breath, so softly it barely reached beyond the railings. But the stallion's head lifted when she did, ears twitching as though catching a sound the men could not hear. He watched her from across the pen, muscles tense, but he did not slam into the rails or rear against the fence as he had done for every other person. The days began to form a rhythm of their own. School, then home, then back down the path to the pen where Diablo waited. Each afternoon Lily arrived with the same steady calm, always lowering herself to the ground, never rushing, never pushing too close. At first Diablo kept his distance, circling her with suspicion, his whole stamping warnings into the earth. But over time the violence of his pacing softened. Instead of anger, his steps carried uncertainty, and instead of pinning his ears back in hostility, he began to flick them forward whenever Lily stirred or shifted. The men who had once mocked her started to linger again. At first they watched with amusement, expecting each visit to end in disappointment. But as the pattern repeated day after day, their smirks gave way to silence. It was difficult to laugh when they themselves had been tossed like rag dolls, while this little girl, with no rope and no saddle, sat calmly outside the rails and commanded the stallion's attention without a single touch. By the end of the first week, whispers moved among the ranch hands and buyers who wandered through. The wild mustang didn't listen to anyone, but he had started to listen to her. John saw it too, though he tried not to admit it aloud. Each evening, he walked her back home, his hand heavy on her shoulder, warning her the danger, reminding her that the horse could crush her without a second thought. But in the quiet of his own mind, he felt the gnawing recognition of what he was witnessing. The stallion who had thrown every rider without mercy was beginning to lower his defenses, if only fraction by fraction, to a child whose greatest weapon was stillness. On the fourth day, as Lily traced her usual shapes into the dirt, Diablo stepped closer to the rail than ever before. He did not lunge, did not rear. He only stood, his breath loud and hot, his head angled down toward the ground where her twig danced. Dust stirred faintly around his hooves as he shifted, uncertain, and then his ears flicked forward, both of them, fully and openly, as though he had chosen to listen rather than fight. The ranch hands who had gathered fell quiet all at once, their boots scuffing nervously against the earth, as though even their noise might break the fragile thread connecting the girl and the horse. By the sixth day, Diablo no longer pinned his ears back when she arrived. He paced less and watched more, each movement deliberate, almost hesitant. When she hummed, his head lifted. When she sighed, his ears turned toward her. It was not obedience in the way men train horses, nor submission born of fear. It was something else, something unteachable, a recognition, a beginning of trust that had grown not from force, but from repetition, patience, and presence. John stood at the edge of the yard as the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the corral. He rubbed his chin with a hand that trembled just slightly, remembering his daughter's voice, soft and sure, telling him once that some horses could never be broken but could choose to befriend. Watching Lily and Diablo in that moment, he understood what she had meant. The mustang had not yet chosen, but he was leaning toward it, drawn each day by the quiet persistence of a little girl who refused to see only danger. What had begun as a defiant standoff was slowly becoming a conversation, carried not in words or ropes, but in silence and small gestures. And though John still feared what might come if that trust shattered, he could not deny the truth forming before his eyes. Diablo, the stallion no man could ride, had begun to listen, and the only voice he listened for belonged to his granddaughter. By the end of the second week, Diablo's name had spread far beyond the auction yard. He was no longer just a stallion that bucked off every rider. He had become the subject of gossip in every diner, feed store, and church gathering in the county. The tale of the little girl sitting cross-legged by the pen had traveled just as far, but not everyone repeated it with wonder. Most spoke with disbelief, others with derision. A wild horse was dangerous enough for a grown man. What kind of grandfather let a child walk straight into its jaws? The first time John overheard was at the hardware store. He had gone in for nails, nothing more, and found himself frozen by the low hiss of voices near the counter. "It's reckless," one man muttered, shaking his head. "That horse will kill the girl before summer's out." Another replied, "I always thought John Carter had more sense. Guess grief will drive a man to foolishness." They did not notice him standing there until he shifted his weight, and then their voices went silent, the kind of silence that only deepened the sting. He paid for his nails without a word, but the echo of those sentences followed him out the door and onto the empty road home. By the time Sunday service came, the whispers had multiplied. Parents nudged one another as Lily walked down the aisle with him. Their eyes not on her bright dress or her braids, but on the invisible shadow they believed trailed her, the dark, dangerous shape of the horse in the pen. A woman stopped him outside the church steps, her tone polite but edged with disapproval. "John," she said, "children need protection, not experiments. That animal is wild. Letting her near it is tempting the Lord's patience." He forced a smile, tipped his hat, and walked away before she could say more. But again, her words carried home with him like burrs stuck to his clothes. At night, when Lily had gone to bed and the house was still, John sat by the fire and asked himself the questions he refused to answer in public. Was he being reckless? Was he blinded by the memories of his daughter? Seeing her face reflected in the child and letting nostalgia overrule reason? He pictured the stallion's hooves striking the ground, the force of his body slamming into the rails, the raw power that had already bloodied grown men. What would happen if the animal turned on Lily without warning? The thought twisted his gut, keeping him awake long after the embers had cooled. The next afternoon, when Lily tugged at his sleeve and asked to go down to the pen, he hesitated longer than usual. She looked up at him with those clear eyes, patient but insistent, and for a moment he almost said no. He nearly told her that the horse was too dangerous, that the townsfolk were right, that it was time to put an end to her visits. But then he remembered the sight of Diablo's ears flicking forward at the sound of her humming, the way the stallion's body had stilled in her presence when he had only ever fought against everyone else. The memory clashed with the warnings he'd heard in town, leaving him caught in the middle. As they walked the familiar path, he noticed more figures watching from the fence line than before. Neighbors had come not to marvel, but to measure his judgment. They leaned on the rails, arms crossed, muttering beneath their breath. Every step of Lily's small feet in the dust seemed louder under their scrutiny. When she sat down cross-legged with her stick, John stood a little straighter, aware that every eye was trained not just on the stallion, but on him. Diablo did what he always did. He paced, then stopped, ears forward, gaze fixed on the child. And the crowd, instead of being awed, exchanged knowing glances that said one thing: it's only a matter of time. Their disbelief was heavier than their words, and John felt it press against him like the weight of the sun. That night, he poured himself a cup of coffee and left it untouched on the table. His hands rested on the wood, fingers spread wide as though bracing himself against the doubts that crowded his mind. He wanted to believe in what he had seen, the impossible thread of connection between a wild stallion and a little girl. But he could not escape the sound of those voices, whispering of recklessness and danger. For the first time, he wondered if he was not guiding Lily, but failing her. Still, when morning came, she was at his side again, ready to walk to the pen. He sighed, lifted his hat, and followed. The town's doubt clung to him, but his granddaughter's faith pulled him forward. And somewhere between those two forces, he continued on, uncertain which one would prove right in the end. The morning broke cold and clear, the kind of morning where breath rose in clouds and frost clung stubbornly to fence posts. John pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders as he walked beside Lily toward the pen. He had hardly slept the night before, his mind circling the same arguments he had been wrestling with for days. The whispers of the town still weighed heavy on him, and part of him considered turning back, inventing some excuse to keep Lily from approaching the stallion today. but her small hand in his gave him no room for retreat. She skipped along, unbothered by the chill, her eyes fixed ahead on the figure pacing within the rails. Diablo was already awake, his breath steaming in the cool air, his muscles rippling as he moved. His dark coat shone under the early light, every line of his body alive with defiance. Yet there was something different this morning. His ears, though still pricked and alert, were not flattened. His pacing seemed less like rage and more like restless curiosity. John noticed it immediately, though he told himself not to hope too much. Horses were unpredictable, especially ones like Diablo. Lily slipped from his hand before they reached the fence, moving with the same light step she always carried. She lowered herself to the ground, cross-legged in the dirt, as if it were a ritual she and the horse had agreed upon. This time, though, she didn't hum or draw. She simply sat, her breath puffing into the air, her gaze steady on Diablo. The stallion stopped mid-step and stared back. The men leaning against the fence noticed the pause too. Their chuckles from earlier in the week had returned, though softened with unease. One muttered, "Any second now he'll charge." Another shook his head, confident the child was moments away from learning a hard lesson. John heard them, but his eyes stayed on the horse. He couldn't look away. Diablo lowered his head slightly, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the ground, the rails, the unfamiliar frost. Then, without warning, he took a step toward her. John's chest tightened. His hand twitched as if to reach for her, to pull her back, but Lily didn't move. She stayed planted, her hands resting on her knees, calm as though nothing in the world could frighten her. Another step. The earth quivered faintly under the weight of him, his hooves pressing prints into the frost-hardened soil. His ears flicked forward, his breathing heavier now, the clouds of his breath rising between them. The onlookers had fallen silent. The usual muttering and scoffing faded, until all that remained was the sound of hooves pressing the ground and the horse's breath in the cold air. When he stood just a few feet away, he stopped again, his neck arched, head held high, testing the air as though trying to understand a little figure who dared remain so still. Lily slowly lifted her hand, palm open, trembling ever so slightly in the cold. She didn't reach for him, only offered. It felt as if time froze in that moment. John's own breath caught, his heart hammering against his ribs. Around him, grown men who had years of riding and roping behind them leaned forward in disbelief. Diablo's head lowered, almost hesitantly, until his muzzle was level with the girl's hand. Then it happened. His nose brushed her palm, warm and damp against her skin. Lily's lips parted in the smallest of smiles, her eyes soft, unafraid. A gasp rippled through the yard, breaking the silence like a stone dropped in water. The men at the fence jerked upright, eyes wide. Some muttered words of disbelief. Others swore under their breath. But no one laughed now. For John, it was as though he were watching something sacred. His granddaughter and the untamable horse, bound together in a moment that defied everything the town had said, everything he had feared. His doubts, his sleepless nights, his questions all scattered like leaves in the wind. Diablo lingered there, breathing against her hand, before pulling back with a snort that shook the frost from the rails. But the spell had already been cast. The wild horse had touched the hand of the little girl, and the entire yard knew it. Something had shifted, subtle but undeniable, and no one present could deny they had just witnessed it. John let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For the first time in weeks, he felt the faint stirrings of hope, though he dared not speak it aloud. The men could call him reckless still, but they had seen it with their own eyes. And for Lily, sitting there with her palms still outstretched and her smile small but steady, it was only the beginning. The sun was low in the sky when John carried a folding chair out to the edge of the pen, his steps heavy with the weight of the town's words. Everywhere he went now, there were looks. Some carried pity, some disapproval, but most were laced with judgment. He'd overheard enough in the general store, enough whispered in hushed tones at the diner, to know exactly what people thought. Foolish old man. Reckless. He'll get that child hurt, mark my words. The words clung to him like dust, and though he tried to brush them off, they stayed, creeping into his thoughts at night, when sleep wouldn't come. Yet here he was again, sitting quietly while Lily skipped ahead of him, her small boots crunching on gravel, her hair tied back with the same ribbon her mother once wore. The girl seemed untouched by the town's judgment, her world still simple, her heart clear of the suspicion that poisoned the grown-ups. She didn't see danger in Diablo's flaring nostrils or restless pacing. She only saw a lonely creature that no one dared to understand. Diablo was restless that evening, his hooves striking at the dirt with sharp sounds that made John tense. The horse's ears flicked back as he circled, his muscles tight beneath his sleek, dark coat. John shifted uneasily in his chair, torn between standing guard and allowing his granddaughter the space she always seemed to need. He wanted to call her back, to remind her that this was still a wild animal capable of violence, but the word stayed lodged in his throat. Lily, as always, moved without fear. She settled on the ground near the fence, her knees tucked under her chin, and began humming a soft, lilting tune. It wasn't a song John recognized, but it carried the same gentle rhythm her mother used to sing at night, when the world seemed too heavy. The sound seemed to float on the cooling air, weaving itself into the space between child and horse. At first, Diablo continued to pace, snorting with irritation, but gradually his steps slowed. His ears twitched, not pinned back, but rotating toward the sound. His dark eyes fixed on Lily, the hardness in them easing into something unreadable. He stepped closer, his great hooves pressing into the dirt with a deliberate slowness, until he stood near enough for the girl's song to reach him clearly. John gripped the arms of his chair, the wood creaking under his tightening fingers. His breath came shallow, ready for the moment Diablo would lunge or shy away in fury. But the stallion only stood there, ears forward, the tension in his frame seeming to drain as the minutes passed. Then, in a gesture so slight John almost missed it, Diablo lowered his head, his mane falling like a curtain along his neck. Lily's small hand lifted, shaking slightly as she reached through the fence. She didn't lunge, didn't push, only offered. The horse's nostrils flared as he sniffed the air around her fingers. For a moment John thought he might bolt again, but instead, Diablo remained still, his breathing steady, his head bent low. Lily's fingers brushed against the thick strands of his mane, tentative at first, then slowly stroking. John nearly rose to his feet, stunned. The pen that had been a place of violence and rejection had shifted in a single moment into something else entirely. The stallion didn't snap his head or rear against the touch. He stayed, muscles no longer rigid, allowing the girl's hand to trace along his mane as she hummed. From the road, two ranchers slowed their walk, their voices carrying faintly across the yard. "She's touching him," one muttered, disbelief in every word. The other gave a low whistle. "That horse would have torn my arm off if I tried. Never seen anything like it." John heard them, but their words were distant compared to what was before his eyes. His heart swelled with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel for weeks. Hope, the doubt planted by neighbors, the whispers of recklessness, the fear that he was failing as guardian to his granddaughter, all of it faded as he watched Diablo lower his head further, pressing gently into Lily's hand as though asking her not to stop. The girl giggled softly, her voice carrying like a bell in the cool air, and Diablo didn't flinch. Instead, he stood calm, letting her fingers tangle in his thick mane. For the first time since he'd been pulled from the wild, the mustang accepted the touch of a human without rage. It was not forced, not taken by strength or rope, but given freely. John leaned back in his chair, his eyes damp though he told himself it was only the cold air. He knew then that no words in the town could undo what he had just seen. Something unexplainable had happened in that quiet pen, something no ridicule or gossip could erase. His granddaughter had reached the untouchable, and for the first time in his long years, John believed that perhaps even the wildest spirits could choose to trust. Thomas Gray was a man whose presence carried weight in the county. His ranch stretched across more acres than John could count. His cattle roamed wide under the open sky, and his name held sway at every auction. When word of the little girl and the mustang began to spread, it didn't take long before Thomas came calling. He arrived one morning with his boots polished, his hat tipped low, and his eyes narrowed at the sight of Diablo pacing in the pen. John was leaning on the fence, watching Lily draw shapes in the dirt while the horse circled near her. Diablo's movements, though restless, were no longer filled with the fury they once carried. His ears flicked often toward the girl, his head lowering in intervals as though he was curious despite himself. To John, it was proof of change. To Thomas, it was weakness waiting to snap. "You're playing with fire, Carter," Thomas said, his voice sharp as the creak of leather in his saddle. "That animal's no good. He's already proven it." He spat into the dust, his gaze never leaving the horse. "But I'll take him off your hands. I'll pay a fair price, and you can be rid of the problem before your granddaughter gets herself killed." John straightened, his jaw tightening. He'd heard the same tone 100 times before from men who believed they knew better. Men who saw him now as a frail old rancher long past his prime. He wanted to ignore the words, to let them slide off his back, but Thomas pressed on. "Think about it," the man said, reaching into his vest pocket and pulling out a folded check. "Cash ready. I'll even load him up today. You've got nothing to lose, Carter, except maybe that little girl if you keep letting her near him." His words lingered like smoke, cutting deep. Lily looked up at her grandfather then, her wide eyes filled not with fear, but with certainty. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. John saw the same determination he once saw in his daughter, a spirit that refused to bend to doubt. The whispers of the town were still in John's ears, clawing at his thoughts. Reckless, foolish, irresponsible. Every one of those words lined up with what Thomas was now throwing at him, dressed up in the form of concern. For a moment, John faltered. He imagined the safety of handing Diablo over, the silence that would come once the horse was gone. No more gossip, no more sleepless nights wondering if he was doing right by Lily. But then Diablo stopped pacing. He came to a halt near the fence, lowering his head slightly in Lily's direction. The girl, still sitting cross-legged, extended her hand just as she had before. This time, the mustang didn't shy away. He leaned closer, nostrils flaring, and let the air between them settle. The sight froze John in place. It wasn't chance. It wasn't luck. There was something undeniable forming, something no money could replace. John turned back to Thomas, who was watching with raised brows and a scoff waiting on his lips. The older man's hand hovered over the check, but John didn't reach for it. He crossed his arms instead, his shoulders squared in a way that hadn't felt natural in years. "Diablo is not for sale," John said finally, his voice firm, steady. "Not now, not ever." Thomas let out a sharp laugh, folding the check and slipping it back into his pocket. "You're a stubborn old fool," he sneered. "That horse will turn on you. And when he does, don't expect me to clean up the mess." He tugged at his reins and turned his horse back toward the road, his figure shrinking in the rising dust as he rode away. John stood rooted to the ground, his heart pounding with the weight of his choice. The whispers would grow louder now, the doubt heavier, but in his chest there was also a quiet strength. Behind him, Lily reached through the fence again, her small hand brushing Diablo's mane with a tenderness that no man's money could buy. The mustang did not fight, did not bolt, but stood still, ears relaxed, his breath warm against her skin. John exhaled slowly, the decision now sealed. Whatever lay ahead, judgment, risk, or danger, he would face it. For the bond that was forming between girl and horse was worth more than any check Thomas Gray could ever write. Each morning before school, and each afternoon when the sun dipped lower over the hills, Lily found her way to Diablo's pen. She never carried rope, never dragged a whip, never raised her voice. She simply walked, her small boots leaving lines in the dust, her arms swinging gently at her sides. At first, Diablo only watched her. His ears flicked, his head lifted high, his eyes sharp with suspicion. But gradually, something began to change. His pacing slowed, his steps fell in rhythm with hers, and the restless stamping of his hooves softened into measured movements that matched the little girl's stride. John Carter, leaning against the wooden rails, found himself holding his breath each time. He expected the mustang to lash out, to charge, to revert to the demon the county called him. Instead, the animal moved as though some invisible tether bound him to the girl's quiet determination. For John, the sight was both unsettling and mesmerizing. He had spent his youth breaking horses with grit and force, teaching them submission through dominance. Yet here was his granddaughter, a child with no experience, doing the opposite, inviting trust rather than demanding it. The first time Lily walked the full length of the pen with Diablo shadowing her steps, a few neighbors had gathered nearby, drawn by curiosity. They murmured, some shaking their heads, others whispering warnings. To them, it looked like danger waiting to explode, a ticking clock before tragedy. Yet Lily did not falter. She walked the line once, twice, 3 times, her pace steady, her gaze forward, never forcing the horse but never wavering either. By the 3rd circuit, Diablo's breathing had slowed, his head dipped slightly lower, and his eyes no longer darted with suspicion but followed her calmly. In the evenings, when the yard grew quiet, John sat on the porch replaying what he had seen. Doubt gnawed at him. He knew the gossip that painted him as reckless was not unfounded. If something went wrong, if Diablo lashed out, the blame would be his alone. He thought of his daughter, how she once coaxed wild colts into calmness with nothing but patience. He wondered if Lily had inherited more than her spirit. But was it fair to risk her safety on that hope? Lily, however, carried no such doubts. Each day she returned with new resolve, adding small gestures to her walks. She would pause suddenly, and Diablo would stop, nostrils flaring but body still. She would turn sharply, and after a beat, the horse would pivot too, dust scattering under his hooves. What had begun as coincidence soon took on the form of understanding. Where she went, he followed not out of fear, but choice. One afternoon, when John thought the routine had settled into predictability, Lily tried something new. She picked up a small bucket, not to feed him, but simply to carry it in her hand as she walked. Diablo's ears flicked forward, his muscles stiffened, and for a moment John tensed, ready to leap the rail if the mustang bolted. But instead of panic, there was curiosity. Diablo lowered his head, snorted at the bucket, then resumed his shadowing steps. The onlookers who had gathered gasped, unable to believe the animal they had deemed unbreakable was now bending to the pace of a child. That night, John lay awake staring at the ceiling. He recalled the men who had tried and failed to mount Diablo, thrown into the dust by sheer fury. Now he saw Lily's small figure walking with the same animal, as though they shared a private language. The whispers of the town echoed in his ears, reckless, dangerous, foolish. But for the first time, he began to wonder if he had been wrong to let their judgment take root in his mind. Perhaps what was unfolding was not recklessness at all, but a kind of miracle forged by trust. As the days passed, Lily's training became less about tasks and more about presence. She hummed softly when she walked, her voice light and steady, and Diablo seemed to relax at the sound. The horse that once threw off grown men with savage force now trailed behind a little girl, as though she were the only compass he trusted. And though John still carried his doubts, each step he witnessed left him torn between fear and awe, caught in the quiet transformation happening right before his eyes. The storm came suddenly, rolling over the hills with a violence that seemed to shake the very earth. Dark clouds swallowed the moonlight, and the wind howled across the plains, rattling windows and snapping branches. Rain began in torrents, hammering the tin roof of the Carter ranch house like 1,000 hooves. John sat in his armchair, staring at the fire that sputtered under the draft, his thoughts heavy with the doubts the town had planted. Every conversation with neighbors had echoed in his mind, words like reckless, foolish, dangerous. He wondered, as the thunder cracked, if they were right. Outside, Diablo was a shadow in motion, crashing against the pen rails with a fury that threatened to splinter the wood. His eyes gleamed wild in the flashes of lightning. His nostrils flared as he reared and slammed down with a power born of terror. The storm was no ordinary night to him. It was a cage tightening, the wind a predator, the sky a roar he could not escape. Each thunderclap drove him harder into panic. His muscles bunching, hooves striking into the ground churned into mud. John rose and pulled on his coat. But before he could step outside, he heard the soft patter of smaller footsteps racing ahead. Lily. She had slipped from her room, her boots half-tied, her hair damp already from the leaking roof. She didn't hesitate as she ran into the rain, her small frame swallowed by the dark. John called after her, his voice swallowed by the storm, but she didn't turn back. The fear in his chest burned hot. Fear not for the storm, but for what she was running toward. At the pen, Diablo's frenzy was terrifying. He crashed sideways against the rails, his breath steaming even in the cold rain, mud flying with every strike of his hose. The fence groaned under the pressure, the nails loosening, with threatening to give way. But Lily did not shrink back. She pressed herself to the rail, her hands gripping the wet boards as if her touch alone could hold them steady. Her voice rose then, soft against the roar of thunder. She whispered his name, Diablo, not as a command, but as though she were telling him a secret. The horse stopped for the briefest moment, ears flicking toward her through the sheets of rain. Another thunderclap shook the ground, and he reared again, but her voice followed, steady and unbroken, weaving through the storm like a thread pulling him back from the edge. John stood frozen a few yards away, his coat plastered his body, rain running into his eyes. He could barely hear her words, yet he saw the effect. Each time Lily spoke, Diablo hesitated, his ears pinned forward, his head turned toward her instead of the sky. His muscles still trembled, his hooves still struck the mud, but something in him shifted. Slowly, agonizingly, the fury ebbed. The storm still raged around them, but Diablo's wildness no longer fought alone. He began to breathe in rhythm with Lily's voice, his sides heaving but his head lowering inch by inch. Finally, with one last crash of thunder, he stilled. His legs sank slightly into mud as if drained of their rage, his body slick with rain. His eyes, wide and burning, fixed on a little girl who hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, hadn't left him to the storm. And in that fragile moment, trust, something no rope or whip had ever drawn from him, took its first deep root. John stood stunned, unable to move, unable even to breathe. The child who carried his daughter's spirit had stepped into a storm and calmed a creature no man could master. The townsfolk's warnings, their laughter, their scorn, all seemed small compared to what he had just seen. Lily hadn't tamed Diablo with force. She had given him something no one else had offered. Her presence, her calm, her unwavering belief that he wasn't a beast to be broken, but a soul that could be heard. When the storm passed, leaving the ranch soaked and battered, the memory of that night would remain like a scar etched into the rails of the pen. And for John, it was the moment he knew that no amount of gossip could erase what he had witnessed. Something had begun between girl and horse that defied reason, and it had been born in the heart of thunder. The sheriff arrived one dry afternoon, when the storm's damage was still fresh on the land. The fences glistened with new nails John had hammered in himself, and mud had only just begun to harden under the August sun. His truck pulled up slow, the county seal faded on the door, dust rolling from the tires. Sheriff Howard was not a man who wasted time on pleasantries. He stepped out, hat pulled low, boots creaking as he walked with a wave of authority. Neighbors had clearly spoken in his ear, and their words rode on his shoulders as he strode toward the Carter Ranch house. John met him at the porch, wiping his hands on a rag, his back already stiffening with the knowledge of what was coming. The sheriff wasted no words. He tipped his hat once and then gestured toward the pen where Diablo stood, flanks shining in the sun, mane tangled from the storm but eyes calm for first time in days. "That horse is a problem, John," Howard said flatly. "More than a problem. He's a danger. Half this county's come to me, saying you're letting your granddaughter get too close. You know as well as I do what'll happen if he snaps. That animal should be put down before someone gets hurt." The words landed heavy, though they were not unexpected. John had heard them before in softer tones, from neighbors leaning on fence posts or muttering at the feed store. But hearing them from the sheriff, stamped with the weight of law, cut deeper. For a moment, John said nothing, his eyes drifting toward the pen where Lily now sat cross-legged, humming to herself, Diablo watching her like a sentinel. The wildness in his eyes had softened. Even in silence, there was a dialogue between them no one else seemed able to hear. "You see him there?" John said finally, his voice low but steady. "That's not a killer, Howard. That's a horse that's been hurt and doesn't trust easy. But my granddaughter, she's found a way through. I won't let you take that away." The sheriff's jaw tightened, his lips thinning under the brim of his hat. "John, I've known you a long time. I know you've got a good head, but grief makes men blind. That little girl is all you got left of your daughter, and I get why you're holding on. But what happens if that Mustang turns on her? You'll lose her too. Can you live with that?" John's chest tightened, the weight of memory pressing in. He saw his daughters facing Lily's every day, her gentleness with horses, her courage. He had questioned himself enough times in the quiet of the night to know the sheriff's words weren't without merit. But he also knew what he had seen in the storm. He had witnessed Diablo stop his frenzy at the sound of Lily's voice, had watched the great beast lower his head when no man had ever managed to. That was not madness, it was connection. "I'll live with the risk," John said after a pause, his tone like stone, "because what I see is worth it. If you can't see it, then maybe you don't know horses the way I thought you did." The sheriff studied him long and hard, his eyes narrowing. He glanced toward Lily, then back at John. Finally, he sighed and adjusted his hat. "You're a stubborn man. Always have been. But don't say I didn't warn you. If that horse makes trouble, if one hair on that girl's head is touched, it'll be on you." He turned and walked back to his truck, the dust kicking up behind him. The sound of the engine faded down the dirt road, but his warning lingered like smoke in the air. John remained on the porch, rag still in his hands, his gaze locked on Lily and Diablo. The sheriff had tried to plant fear in him, and maybe he had succeeded a little. But stronger than fear was a conviction that what was happening between that girl and that horse was something no lawman could stamp out. The county could doubt, the neighbors could whisper, the sheriff had threatened, but John knew the truth. The bond was real, and no one was going to take it from them. The morning broke quiet, the kind of pale dawn where the sky held more gray than gold. The roosters had not yet crowed, and the ranch still lay in the hush of sleep. But Lily was awake. She had been lying in bed for hours, her small hands folded tightly against her chest as if holding in a secret too big to carry. The sheriff's warning, the neighbor's mutters, and her grandfather's worried eyes had weighed on her, but beneath it all burned a steady certainty. Diablo wasn't the monster they believed. She knew it the way she knew the sound of her own heartbeat. She slipped from the house barefoot, careful not to wake her grandfather dozing in his chair. The screen door whispered shut behind her, and the chill of dew clung to her toes as she padded across the grass. The yard smelled of damp earth and hay, the air sharp with that freshness only early morning carries. In the dim light, the pen rose ahead, the figure of Diablo already moving inside, his dark shape restless against the paling horizon. Her heart thudded as she reached the fence. This was something no one had told her to do. Everyone had warned her not to, but warnings and whispers hadn't been meant for her. She climbed the rail slowly, each creak was sounding like thunder to her ears. For a moment she sat perched there, watching the stallion. His ears flicked toward her, his head lifting, nostrils flaring. She whispered his name like a prayer. "Diablo." The mustang stilled, the tension in his muscles held, but he didn't bolt or strike. Instead, he lowered his head, eyes following her as she swung down into the pen. Bare feet pressed into cool dirt, and the smell of horse sweat and dust surrounded her. For a breath, the world stopped. She was only a small girl, fragile against the raw strength of the animal before her. But she did not feel small. She felt as if the air between them was a thread pulling them closer. She didn't walk to him right away. Instead, she sat in the dirt, the same way she had for weeks, cross-legged and patient. Her hands picked little lines into the earth, her humming low and steady. The stallion's ears twitched, his body shifting, hooves stamping once as if uncertain. Then, to her amazement, he stepped forward, slowly, cautiously. His shadow loomed over her when he stopped, his breath stirring her hair. She stood, trembling not with fear, but with anticipation. Her small hand lifted, and again his muzzle found her palm, soft and warm against her skin. This time, she did not pull away. Instead, she let her other hand slide gently up his cheek into his tangled mane. He did not snap or rear. He stood still, eyes dark and deep as if searching her. Then it happened. Diablo shifted, lowering himself slightly, his body angling in a way that was neither aggression nor rest. To any onlooker might have meant nothing, but Lily understood. It was an invitation. Her breath caught. Slowly, carefully, she grasped his mane and lifted herself onto his back. No saddle, no bridle, only trust. The world seemed to spin as she settled against him. She felt the heat of his body beneath her legs, the rise and fall of his breath. For a moment, Diablo did not move. The pen was silent, the sky just beginning to blush with morning light. Then, with the gentlest step, he began to walk. Each stride was cautious, deliberate, as though the mustang himself was testing the weight he carried. But he did not buck, did not resist. Lily's hands clutched his mane, her face alight with wonder, her lips parted in a smile too wide to contain. Tears prickled her eyes, but never fell. This was the moment she had dreamed of, the one no one else believed possible. Across the yard, unseen from where she rode, John stirred from his chair. A sound, faint and rhythmic, reached his ears. He pushed himself up, his joints stiff, and stepped onto the porch. His heart nearly stopped when he saw her, his granddaughter, his whole world, astride the horse no man could tame. For a long, stunned moment, he didn't move. Fear surged, but so did awe. Inside the pen, Diablo's stride lengthened slightly, as if gaining confidence with each step. Lily leaned forward, her laughter soft and free. To her, it wasn't just a ride. It was proof that trust could build bridges where force could not. Proof that even the wildest spirit could choose gentleness when met with gentleness. When Diablo finally halted and lowered his head, Lily slid down, her bare feet landing softly in the dirt. She pressed her forehead against his muzzle, whispering words only he could hear. He breathed out a deep, rolling sigh, as though he had been waiting his whole life to be understood. John stood frozen at the fence, the morning sun rising behind him. His heart pounded, his doubts echoing the voices of the town. But what he had just seen made all those voices seem distant, almost meaningless. Something extraordinary had happened, and it was only the beginning. The sun was only just breaking across the horizon when Lily appeared again by the pen, her hair tangled from sleep, her shoes dangling from her hand as she padded barefoot over the cool grass. Diablo had been waiting. At least, it seemed that way to her. His head was lifted, ears forward, his dark eyes trained on her as though he recognized her footsteps before she even reached the fence. She climbed over the rails with practiced ease, landing softly in the dirt. The pen was quiet, but her heartbeat was not. It thundered inside her chest, louder than the waking bird song, louder than the rustle of the breeze against the barn roof. She approached him slowly, humming the same little tune she had been humming for weeks now, a thread of sound that had somehow woven its way into his restless heart. Diablo shifted, but he did not retreat. Instead, he turned his head slightly, as if acknowledging her. When she stretched out her hand, he lowered his muzzle, pressing his breath warm against her fingers. That was all she needed. The rest was courage. Her grandfather's warnings echoed in her ears, sharper now because she knew how many people were talking. The sheriff had practically demanded the horse's death. Thomas Gray had offered money to take him away. The neighbors whispered behind John's back, shaking their heads and muttering about recklessness, about the kind of man who would allow a child to stand so close to danger. John had listened, his jaw tightening with each word, but their voices had planted seeds of doubt in him. He had thought more than once about stepping between Lily and Diablo, ending this fragile experiment before it grew into something worse. But this morning, he wasn't there. Lily was alone in the pen, with nothing between her and the animal they all called untamable. She let her hand rest against his mane, fingers working through the knots and tangles as if braiding invisible threads of trust. Then she did what no one had dared imagine she would. She gripped his mane tightly, pressed her foot gently against his side, and pulled herself upward. The world tilted beneath her. For a heartbeat, she thought she might slide off before she even found her balance. But Diablo shifted, spreading his stance, lowering his body just enough to steady her. It was not the violent reaction everyone expected. No bucking, no wild twisting, no explosion of fury. Instead, it was as if he was bracing himself, aware that she was fragile, that she was small, and that this was not a test of control, but of trust. She found her seat, legs pressed against his warm sides, her hands tangled in his thick mane. He flicked his ears, snorted once, and then cautiously took a step forward. Then another. Lily's breath caught, her body swaying slightly as she adjusted, her heart racing with the rhythm of his careful stride. He was carrying her, It was not the spectacle of a cowboy breaking a horse in with ropes, spurs, and shouting. It was slow, almost gentle, as though Diablo himself had discovered what it felt like to accept a rider. Lily leaned forward, her face nearly against his neck, whispering softly. He walked the length of the pen, his hooves pressing into the dirt in steady beats that seemed to match the pounding of her heart. From the porch, John emerged, drawn by the faint sound of hoofbeats that shouldn't have been so controlled. His eyes widened as he saw her, not just touching, not just standing near, but sitting astride the beast that had thrown every rider who dared try. His first instinct was to shout, to rush forward, to drag her down before anything went wrong. But the sight rooted him to the ground. He saw her small form perched lightly, saw the horse moving not with rage but with care. His body language changed from defiance to something quieter. A lump rose in his throat as memories stirred. His daughter, years ago, riding bareback across the pasture with that same fearlessness, that same inexplicable bond with horses that had made her seem like she was born in the saddle. It was as though Lily had inherited not only her mother's courage, but her mother's gift. By the fence, one of the ranch hands who had come early for chores stopped and stared, his mouth falling open. The sound of his disbelief carried through the morning stillness. Soon others would see, and the whispers of recklessness would be replaced by a different kind of talk, one that John knew could change everything. Inside the pen, Lily sat tall, a smile spreading slowly across her face as she realized she wasn't falling, wasn't being rejected like every grown man before her. Diablo's ears twitched, but his steps remained even. She had done what no one else could. And in that moment, neither she nor the horse seemed aware of the weight of history being written. She leaned forward again, pressing her cheek against his mane, whispering words that only he could hear. He blew out a long breath, a sound like surrender, like relief. The mustang who defied every rider had chosen her, not through force, not through fear, but through trust. And though John's heart hammered with both fear and awe, he knew that what he was witnessing could never be undone. It was the first ride, the one everyone said would never happen, the beginning of something no one in the county would soon forget. The morning light stretched across the ranch yard, long and golden, as John Carter stepped out onto the porch, his coffee cup trembling slightly in his hand. The world still held quiet of early hours, the birds just beginning their chorus, the air carrying the faint chill of night's end. He intended only to scan the yard, to make sure the chores were waiting the way they always did. But what met his eyes struck him harder than any blow. His granddaughter was in the pen, not just standing near the horse, not just daring to brush his mane or hum her soft tunes, but astride the animal. Diablo moved beneath her, not in fury, not in the blind violence that had sent seasoned cowboys sprawling into the dirt, but with measured steps. His ears flicked back and forward, testing the air, testing her weight, but he was calm. He carried her as though he had known her all along, his wild spirit tempered not by force, but by something deeper. John's heart seized in his chest, the air leaving him in a sharp gasp. The coffee cup slipped from his grasp, shattering on the porch boards, forgotten in the wake of what he was witnessing. He had doubted himself countless nights, sitting alone with his thoughts while neighbors' words clung like burrs to his conscience. Reckless, they had said, irresponsible, a fool blinded by grief, letting his granddaughter flirt with danger just because she reminded him of his daughter. The sheriff had stood on that very porch not a week earlier, his voice firm with authority, demanding that the mustang be put down before tragedy struck. Even John had nearly given in to those fears, his love for Lily battling his knowledge of the horse's fury. He had told himself he was wrong to let this go on, but now, as he watched, tears blurred his vision. Lily sat upright, her hands tangled gently in Diablo's mane, her small legs pressed against his sides. She did not look afraid. She did not look reckless. She looked as though she had always belonged there. Diablo, the stallion they had branded unbreakable, the beast too wild for any man, moved with her like he had chosen her above all others. It was impossible, yet undeniable. The sound of hooves against dirt was steady, patient. Each step sent a shiver down John's spine, as though the earth itself bore witness to something it had never carried before. And John, hard, weathered by years of ranch life, a man who had buried his daughter and thought his heart too scarred for softness, felt tears slide hot and unashamed down his cheeks. His chest ached with more than awe. It ached with memory. He saw his daughter again in that pen, her fearless way with horses, her gift that had always seemed half magic. Now, that same gift lived in her child. He leaned heavily against the porch post, gripping it as though the sight might otherwise knock him to the ground. This was no trick, no fleeting moment of calm before the inevitable storm. He could see it in the horse's eyes, still sharp, still wild, but softened with something that none of the men had ever inspired. Trust. He trusted her. A rustle came from the yard gate. One of the ranch hands had wandered up, his mouth parting in disbelief as he caught sight of the scene. Another followed, then another, drawn by the sound of hooves and the whispers that carried faster than the morning breeze. Their voices were low, stunned. John didn't need to hear the words to know. They were seeing the same impossible truth. All the gossip, all the mocking laughter that had painted him as reckless, began to unravel in that moment. He was not reckless. He was witnessing proof that there had been a reason, even if he hadn't fully believed it himself until now. The horse that had sent men to the dirt and the doctor's beds was walking with his granddaughter as if she were an extension of himself. John swiped at his eyes, but the tears kept coming. Not weakness, not shame, relief, pride, and something he could barely name. His granddaughter was not in danger. She was safe, safer than she might have been with any man alive. Diablo had chosen her, and in doing so, he had given John something he thought he had lost forever: hope. For a long moment, John could not move, could not speak. The porch beneath his boots, the fence, the pen, all seemed distant, as though the world had narrowed to that single sight: an 8-year-old girl in a wild mustang rewriting what everyone believed possible. And though the whispers of the neighbors would surely rise again, though the sheriff would return with orders and warnings, John knew he would never forget this morning. For once in his life, he let the tears fall freely. It was the impossible unfolding before his eyes, and he would carry it with him until the end of his days. The fairgrounds bustled with noise, the air thick with a mingled sense of fried dough, dust, and livestock. Children darted between booths with sticky fingers, and the sound of laughter mixed with the metallic clang of a blacksmith's hammer at the far end of the grounds. It was supposed to be a place of lightheartedness, a day when the whole county could forget their worries. But for John Carter, standing just beyond the main ring, the weight pressing on his chest left little room for cheer. He had known this day was coming ever since the first whispers began to spread, but hearing Thomas Gray's voice boom across the crowd forced the moment into being. "Bring the girl and that beast here," Gray shouted, his broad frame towering near the show ring, his hat tipped back, arms crossed. His words cut through the noise, drawing eyes from all directions. If that stallion's truly tamed, let's see it in front of witnesses, not behind closed gates where no one knows what really happens. The crowd's hum shifted instantly into anticipation. Farmers, ranch hands, townsfolk all turned their heads, eager for spectacle. Some smirked, already certain of the outcome. Others exchanged worried glances, whispering about the danger. John felt the stares pressing on him like a weight too heavy to bear. His hand gripped the brim of his hat, twisting it unconsciously. He had hoped to keep the bond between Lily and Diablo quiet, a miracle seen by only a few. But Thomas had forced it into the open, turning it into a test neither man nor child should have to face. John's instinct was to say no, to shield Lily, to tell Gray and the rest of the county that this wasn't some show for their amusement. His voice started to rise in protest, but Lily's small hand tugged at his sleeve. When he looked down, he saw her eyes, wide, steady, and filled with a calm determination he recognized all too well. It was the same look her mother once carried when standing before a horse no one else dared touch. Lily tilted her chin up and spoke softly, though her voice carried with surprising strength. "Grandpa, let me—" The words chilled him. His first thought was fear. The sheriff's warning still rang in his ears. The danger still felt real. But beneath the fear was something else. Trust. Lily had never faltered, not once. Every moment she spent with Diablo seemed to chip away at the walls that rage and fear had built around him. And hadn't John himself wept the first morning he saw her riding bareback, safe and steady? The crowd began to murmur louder, some laughing, some urging them forward. Gray leaned against the fence rail, his smirk widening. Well, reckon we'll wait all day for proof? Or was it all just a tale to fool an old man into thinking his granddaughter had some magic? John's jaw tightened. His pride stung, but it was not pride that made him hesitate. It was love, the deep and fragile kind that had been tested too many times in his life. But Lily's hand squeezed his arm again, insistent, surer. She wasn't afraid, and that alone began to steady him. "All right," John said finally, his voice rough with the weight of it. He straightened his shoulders and met Gray's gaze. "You'll have your proof. But remember what you see here today. Don't you ever call her reckless again." Gasps and chatter rippled through the crowd as word spread fast. John Carter was going to let his granddaughter face Diablo in front of everyone. Men climbed fences to get a better view. Women shook their heads, clutching their children closer. The fair, for all its noise and joy, seemed to hold its breath as John led Lily toward the holding corral. Diablo stood inside, his coat gleaming under the afternoon sun, nostrils flaring at the clamor around him. His hooves stamped restlessly, but when Lily's small figure appeared, something shifted. His ears flicked forward, his eyes locked onto her, and the restless stamping slowed. John caught that detail, and though his fear did not vanish, a fragile thread of hope tightened around his heart. Lily stepped forward with the ease of someone approaching a friend, not a beast with a reputation blackened across the county. She paused at the gate, her hand resting on the wood, and the crowd fell into silence. Even Gray's mocking grin faltered for a moment. John knew there was no turning back now. This was no longer about gossip or doubt. It was about showing the truth of what he'd seen with his own eyes. The entire county would soon witness whether the impossible bond between a wild mustang and an 8-year-old girl was real, or whether it would all come crashing down before them. And as Lily slipped inside the pen, John's heart pounded so loud he could hear nothing else. The arena at the county fair was alive with anticipation, its wooden bleachers creaking beneath the weight of dozens of bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. The dust rose in thin clouds, stirred by boots scuffing impatiently against the packed earth. Men leaned over the rails, chewing tobacco, spitting into the dirt, their eyes fixed on the corral where the notorious stallion stood. Diablo's coat shimmered black beneath the noon sun, each muscle taut, each breath a flare of defiance. His ears pinned back and forward in quick succession, his tail swishing like a whip. He pawed at the ground with such force that small divots opened where his hooves struck. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, punctuated by bursts of laughter. Bets were exchanged with a slap of hands, coins clinking into hats or passing from palm to palm. "No way that wild devil lets her near him," one ranch hand muttered, his lips curling into a grin. Another chimed in, "I say, she won't get close before he throws a fit." More laughter followed, a harsh sound that carried across the arena. It was the same laughter that had haunted John Carter since the whispers first began, the same scorn he had endured for trusting his granddaughter's instincts. Now, here in front of everyone, he felt its full weight pressing on his shoulders. John stood at the edge of the ring, his hat pulled low, arms crossed tightly across his chest. His weathered face revealed none of the storm raging within him, but his heart was pounding hard enough to shake his composure. He wanted nothing more than to pull Lily away, to end the spectacle before it began. Yet beside him, Lily's small frame stood rooted in quiet stillness, her eyes fixed on the stallion. Her face bore none of the nervousness that creased the brows of the men around them. She held herself as if this were not a trial, but a meeting long overdue. The sheriff leaned against a post nearby, shaking his head. "Carter, this is madness," he muttered. "If that horse goes for her, I won't be able to stop it." John heard him, but he didn't answer. There was no answer to give. He could only place his faith in what he had already seen with his own eyes, that bond forged not by force, but by patience and trust. Inside the arena, Diablo's agitation grew. He circled the ring in wide strides, the whites of his eyes flashing as he tossed his head. Every time the crowd erupted in laughter or jeers, he jerked violently, ears flattening, teeth bared. The Cowboys watching sneered, their faces alight with the kind of grim satisfaction that comes from expecting disaster. A few shouted out taunts meant for John. "This is what happens when you let children play with fire," one yelled. "Better get a rope ready." John's fist clenched. But before his anger could rise into words, Lily stepped forward. She slipped through the gate with a quiet grace, her braid bouncing lightly against her back, her boots sinking into the dirt. At once, the crowd stilled. The jeers died into silence, as if everyone collectively held their breath. Diablo froze mid-stride, his body stiff, nostrils flaring. He snorted sharply, pawing the ground again, but his eyes, dark, burning, locked on Lily's small figure. For a moment that stretched endlessly, the arena became a place outside of time. The rattle of the fair, the smell of food, the hum of voices, all seemed to fade, leaving only the steady thud of hooves and the soft sound of Lily's steps. She moved slowly, not with the swagger of a cowboy seeking control, but with the gentle assurance of someone entering a conversation rather than a fight. She stopped just inside the ring, her hands hanging loose at her sides. The murmurs returned, softer now, uncertain. Some gasped, others whispered prayers. Diablo's ears flicked forward, then back, his breathing sharp and uneven. The stallion's muscles quivered as if caught between two worlds, instinct screaming to strike, something deeper urging stillness. Then Lily bent her knees and sat cross-legged in the dirt, just as she had done for weeks at the edge of his pen. She did not call to him, did not raise her hands. She simply waited, her calm presence more powerful than any rope or rein. The cowboys scoffed again, though their voices were lower now. "She's wasting her time," one said. Another muttered, "He'll charge before she gets close." But even they leaned forward, unable to look away. John's throat tightened as he watched. The memory of his daughter flickered in his mind. Her laughter carried on the wind, her gentle hand on the neck of a frightened colt years ago. That same spirit lived now in Lily. And though the crowd saw only a child, John knew he was witnessing something far greater. Diablo's pawing slowed. His head lowered, his stride shortened, and step by step, he turned toward Lily. The crowd gasped as his massive form drew closer, each hoof fall a thunderous echo in the silence. Dust swirled around them as horse and girl locked eyes, and the fair's arena, filled with doubt and scorn, became a stage for a moment no one had dared believe possible. The silence that fell over the arena was unlike anything the county fair had ever known. Moments earlier, the air had been thick with laughter, bets, and scorn, but now every voice was caught in a breathless pause. Dust swirled lazily in the shafts of sunlight streaming into the ring as Lily, small and steady, placed one bare foot on the lower rail and pulled herself up onto the mustang's back. Diablo did not rear, did not lash out, did not thrash as he had with every man who had dared approach him before. Instead, he stood rooted in place, his massive frame rising tall and still, his ears flicked forward as if he were listening only to the quiet presence of the girl. John Carter's heart pounded in his chest, his eyes fixed on the sight before him. He had braced for disaster, every muscle in his body ready to leap into the arena if Diablo so much as shifted wrong. But instead of violence, he was watching history turn in slow motion. Lily swung her leg over, settling into place without saddle or reins, her small hands resting against the thick curve of the stallion's neck. She leaned close, whispering something only he could hear. Diablo's great chest expanded with a deep, grounding breath. The beast had been branded Diablo, for his fury now seemed to bow his spirit to the trust of a child. The cowboys who had been jeering were the first to falter. Their mocking grins slid into silence. Their hats tugged lower as if to hide expressions they could not control. One man muttered, "Impossible," under his breath, the word breaking the hush like a crack in glass. Another whispered, "I'll be damned," his voice filled with awe instead of mockery. The sheriff, who had warned so sternly against keeping the stallion alive, found himself clutching the fence rail as if to steady his legs. And then Diablo moved, not in a frantic, unpredictable burst, but in a steady rhythm. His hooves struck the earth in a smooth, deliberate trot, dust rising in soft cloud behind him. He carried Lily with a grace none thought him capable of, his gait even, his back steady. It was not the wild gallop of a beast resisting his rider, nor the furious bucking that had thrown seasoned men like rag dolls. It was something else entirely, a careful, almost proud stride, as though he knew this moment mattered. Lily's braid bounced gently against her back as she sat upright, her face glowing with a joy too pure to be mistaken for recklessness. Her hands did not grip tightly. They rested as though she were simply part of him. Not his master, not his conqueror, but his companion. The hush of the crowd deepened. Each onlooker caught in the spell of the bond they had dismissed as impossible. Parents clutched their children closer, not out of fear, but to draw them near to history unfolding before their eyes. John's vision blurred with tears, unbidden and unashamed. He saw not just Lily on the horse, but the reflection of his daughter years ago, her gentle hands working magic with animals that others called untrainable. For a moment, he felt as though the past and present had folded into one, as though the gift had not died with her, but been carried forward in the little girl, now riding with such ease. His chest swelled with both pride and sorrow, his hands trembling where they gripped the brim of his hat. The murmurs began again, not cruel this time, but reverent. Words passed from mouth to mouth, disbelief giving way to wonder. She's riding him. He's carrying her. Look at that. He's not even fighting. The crowd leaned forward, drawn into the quiet miracle that replaced the spectacle of violence they had expected. The sneers were gone, replaced by awe. Even Thomas Gray, the rancher who had pushed hardest to claim Diablo for himself, stood frozen, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on the impossible sight before him. Diablo's trot carried Lily around the arena, the dust painting a trail of proof behind them. When he slowed, it was not from defiance, but from care, lowering his pace as if mindful of the small rider on his back. The sharp snorts that had once signaled rage now sounded almost like sighs of release. His body no longer a battlefield of tension, but a vessel of power finally at ease. When Lily leaned forward and patted his neck, the crowd exhaled as one. The silence broke, but not into laughter or mockery. Applause erupted, first hesitant, then thunderous, echoing against the wooden stands, rolling across the fairgrounds. Hats flew into the air, cheers rose like a wave, and voices called out her name with disbelief and admiration. John stood straighter, his heart no longer heavy with doubt. The voices that scorned him were silenced not by argument, but by the living truth moving with quiet pride in the ring. Diablo had not been tamed by force. He had chosen trust, and in doing so he had silenced every critic, every doubter, every whisper of recklessness. And at the center of it all sat Lily, calm and radiant, her small figure atop a horse once thought untouchable, carrying herself not as someone who had conquered a beast, but as someone who had been accepted. The crowd saw it now, the bond that could not be denied. And in that moment, Diablo was no longer the devil of the county. He was something else entirely. By the time Diablo carried Lily past the crowd for the second lap, the shift in the air was undeniable. The first circuit had been met with stunned silence, as if no one dared to breathe in case the spell broke. But as the horse trotted steadily on, his muscles rippling beneath the sunlight, his ears tilted toward the girl on his back, the silence dissolved into something else. A murmur at first, then a ripple of voices, until the sound became a tide of cheers that filled the arena. The same people who had whispered warnings, who had called John a fool for allowing this moment, now clapped and shouted encouragement. They were not witnessing a beast brought to heel. They were witnessing something much rarer, trust freely given. John stood at the rail, his hands gripping the rough wood so tightly his knuckles whitened. His mind had been a battlefield for weeks. Every sideways glance from neighbors, every word doubt had cut into him, sharpening his own fears. He had begun to wonder if perhaps they were right, if letting Lily near Diablo was a kind of madness born of grief and stubborn pride. But now, as he watched the two moving as one, the weight lifted. This was not recklessness. This was revelation. The horse was not submitting to dominance. He was choosing connection. The Cowboys, who had spent days ridiculing the idea of a child approaching such a creature, now leaned forward with expressions softened by awe. Some shook their heads in disbelief, but their eyes betrayed admiration. The sheriff, who had insisted the horse be destroyed, found himself swallowing back his pride, his stern warning silenced by the sight of an 8-year-old doing what no armed man could. Even Thomas Gray, who had been ready to buy Diablo as a trophy to break, stood rigid, his jaw tight, his pride stung by the realization that the horse had given something to the child that he never would have to him. Trust without condition. As the mustang trotted past, The sound of his hooves was steady, almost rhythmic against the packed dirt. Lily sat upright, her braids swinging lightly, her face glowing with quiet triumph. She did not look to the crowd, did not bask in their sudden approval. Her focus was fixed entirely on Diablo, her small hand resting gently on his neck, her lips moving in a whisper only he could hear. To her, this was not about proving anyone wrong. It was about being seen, by him, by the horse who had once lived only in rage and defiance. The transformation was not only in Diablo, though his change was undeniable. The animal who had flung men like rag dolls, who had shattered rails with the force's fury, now moved with a careful grace, adjusting his stride as if to protect the small figure on his back. His eyes no longer burned with wild mistrust, but softened into a steady watchfulness. The beast they had all feared seemed to fade with each lap, replaced by a creature whose strength was no less, but whose spirit had been altered by trust. But the crowd, too, was transformed. Just days earlier, their gossip had painted John as reckless, even dangerous. They had whispered in church pews, at the feed store, across the fences of their own properties, saying that grief had blinded him, that he was putting Lily at risk for the sake of pride. Now those same mouths cheered and clapped. Their doubts turned into pride they would later claim had been there all along. Parents lifted their children onto their shoulders so they could see better. Voices called out Lily's name. And for once the ranch was not a place of suspicion, but a celebration. John's throat tightened as he took off his hat, holding it against his chest. For him, this was not about vindication, though it soothed a deep wound to see the judgment of others melt away. For him, it was about the truth of what was happening before his eyes. His granddaughter was carrying forward something her mother had once carried, a gift that could not be explained, only witnessed. And the horse, once destined for destruction, was being remade in that gift. By the second lap, the scene had shifted from spectacle to memory in the making. People who had come expecting to see a child thrown were instead witnesses to something they would tell and retell for years. The cheers grew louder, echoing through the arena, spilling into the fairgrounds beyond. Diablo's stride quickened slightly, not in defiance, but as if lifted by the sound, carrying Lily with a pride that matched her calm determination. It was no longer a battle of wills. It was no longer man versus beast, safety versus danger, reason versus recklessness. It was something far simpler and far greater. A bond, a girl and a horse, finding in each other a trust that silenced every doubt. And as the sun glinted off the dust rising around them, it was clear to all who watched that they were not just witnessing an extraordinary ride. They were witnessing a transformation of the horse, of the girl, and of every heart that had once dismissed the impossible. The offers came almost before the dust of the fairground had settled. That night, as Diablo rested in his pen and Lily leaned against the rails humming softly to him, word had already spread beyond the county line. By the following morning, trucks began to arrive, polished and gleaming, carrying men in pressed jeans, clean boots, and wide-brimmed hats that looked more ornamental than worn. These were not the ranchers who scraped a living from the dry earth. These were breeders, men who saw horses less as creatures and more as investments, their worth measured in bloodlines and dollar signs. They approached John first, respectful in tone but eager in intent. One man, his belt buckle catching the sunlight, spoke smoothly about the rarity of a mustang like Diablo, about his raw power and stamina, about how such a horse could change a breeding line forever. He drew out a checkbook with a flourish, writing a number so large John's breath caught for a moment. It was more money than he had seen in years, more than the ranch had brought in during the hardest seasons when cattle prices fell and fences broke faster than they could be mended. Another followed, topping the first figure, offering even more, his voice heavy with assurance. "You'd be doing the smart thing," he said, his eyes flicking to Diablo as though the animal were already his. "That horse belongs in the hands of men who know what to do with him, men who can harness him, use him right, not waste him." The others murmured their agreement, each offer climbing higher, blank checks being pulled from leather-bound folders, pens clicking against paper. John listened, his weathered face betraying little, but inside his thoughts churned. The ranch needed repairs. The barn roof leaked, the well pump faltered, and the pastures were thin from drought. The money could secure Lily's future. could ease away the bills that stacked silently in his desk drawer. He had spent his life fighting for every scrap of stability, and here it was being handed to him in numbers that would erase years of worry. But then his gaze shifted. Lily stood just beyond the men, her small figure pressed against the rail of Diablo's pen. She wasn't watching the breeders or their checks. Her eyes were on the horse, her hand resting on the wood as though it anchored her. Diablo, once furious at any approach, stood still, his head lowered toward her, ears flicking as if listening for her voice even in silence. The connection between them was unshakable, something that no number on paper could replicate. John cleared his throat, unsure of how to answer. He looked toward his granddaughter, searching her face for guidance he could not find in his own heart. It was then that she turned to him, her expression calm but firm, her braids slipping over her shoulder as she shook her head once, deliberately. It was a child's gesture, yet it carried a weight that silenced the noise of the breeder's promises. The men noticed and chuckled, mistaking her refusal for innocence. "She doesn't understand," one of them said lightly. "Kids grow attached, but she'll see reason in time. This is business, not play." Another leaned closer to John, his voice dropping. "Think of her future. Think of the security. You can't let a child's fancy stand in the way of this kind of fortune." But John's mind was no longer clouded by doubt. He had spent weeks haunted by the whispers of neighbors, questioning his judgment, fearing that grief had steered him wrong. Yet the fair had shown him what he needed to see. His daughter's gift lived on in Lily, and through her, the horse had been saved from the ruin of his rage. To sell Diablo now, to hand him over to men who saw him as a commodity, would not be a decision born of wisdom. It would be betrayal of Lily, of his late daughter, and of the bond that had been forged with such patience. He folded his arms across his chest and shook his head. "He's not for sale," John said quietly, but with finality that cut through the murmurs. The breeders protested, waving their checks higher, offering to double, even triple sums. But John did not waver. His eyes returned to Lily, who had stepped closer to Diablo now, her fingers brushing against his mane, and he knew the answer had never truly been in question. As the breeders drove away, their engines rumbling with frustration, John remained at the rail, hat in hand. The fortune they had offered was real, but the treasure he already held was beyond price. In the silence that followed, broken only by the soft snore of the mustang and Lily's quiet humming, John felt a strange peace settle over him. For the first time in a long while, he no longer questioned himself. The world could laugh, gossip, and scorn, but here in this bond was something worth more than all the wealth he had been promised. The fairground was nearly empty by the time the dust began to settle. The booths had been packed away. The sound of laughter and shouting dimmed into memory, and only a few scraps of hay and paper cups littered the arena. The silence felt strange after the roar of the crowd that had watched Diablo carry Lily across the ring without a single buck or flare of rage. Now the stands were quiet, and the mustang stood once again in his pen, his breath steady but his eyes softer than they had ever been. Lily slipped away from the lingering adults. Men still arguing over what they had seen, women shaking their heads, children pulling at their mother's skirts to talk about the miracle of the wild horse. She carried none of that noise with her. Her small feet patted softly on the dirt as she walked the pen, braids swinging against her back, her heart still racing with the thrill of what she had done. John watched from a distance, leaning heavily on the fence post, his hands trembling not from age but from the weight of everything that had nearly happened and everything that had been avoided. When Lily reached the rails, she didn't call out. She didn't wave her arms or clap her hands the way the Cowboys had tried. Instead, she lowered her voice, soft as a secret, and whispered toward the towering mustang. The words themselves didn't matter, gentle fragments about the sky, the smell of hay, her own mother's lullabies half remembered. Her tone was what carried, a steady ribbon of calm threading through the cool evening air. Diablo, ears twitching, shifted his weight and then slowly bent his massive head toward her. The men who had spent months trying to break him would not have recognized the sight. The horse who had thrown riders, snapped reins, and crashed against rails now stood still, nostrils flaring with warm breath as his nose brushed the girl's shoulder. His touch wasn't heavy, not a shove or a test of strength, but something closer to a question. Lily's eyes widened, her breath catching as she froze for a moment, then steadied herself the way her mother once had when guiding a horse's head into her hands. In that quiet moment, she realized something no one else could have explained to her. She hadn't tamed him. She hadn't bent his will or conquered his wildness. He had chosen. Out of all the hands that had tried to rope him, all the voices that had shouted commands, all the eyes that had burned with conquest, he had found her and decided to stay. Trust, she understood now, was never forced. It wasn't something you pulled from a creature with threats or rewards. It was given freely, and it could vanish just as easily. She pressed her cheek against his mane, feeling the coarse hair and the steady warmth beneath it. "Thank you," she whispered, though her voice cracked under the weight of emotions too big for her age. Her fingers curled into his coat, not to hold him, but to let him know she was there, that she understood. Diablo exhaled, a deep and rolling sound that rumbled through her bones, and the brush of his breath warmed her neck. Behind her, John wiped at his eyes, though he would never admit it to anyone who asked. He saw his daughter's gentleness reflected in Lily, the same patience, the same refusal to meet fear with force. And he saw in a horse something almost human, the way pain and distrust to be overcome not by power, but by quiet faith. As the last light of the day faded and the arena lamps flickered on, Lily stayed by Diablo's side, whispering little things that only he could hear. The world outside could call a miracle or a trick, could argue and bet and scorn, but to Lily, it was simpler. Trust was not hers to demand. It was his to give. And tonight, against every expectation, the wild mustang had given it to her. The night after the fair, when the town was still buzzing with talk, John Carter sat on the porch of his ranch house, his hat tilted low to hide the wetness in his eyes. The creak of a rocking chair kept him company as he replayed the day over and over. The image of Lily, his granddaughter, sitting tall on the back of Diablo, the horse every man had called a demon, was burned into his mind. He could hear the silence of crowd, the disbelief, and then the eruption of cheers. Yet beneath it all was something quieter, a memory that had risen like smoke from an old fire he thought long extinguished. He saw his daughter. Her name had been Grace, and she had been a firebrand with the gentleness of a morning breeze. From the time she was a girl, she had shown a gift with horses no one could explain. John remembered the day she was barely older than Lily is now, when she had walked in the corral, where a mustang newly brought in from the wild reared and snorted with fury. Every ranch hand had warned her back, but Grace had laughed, light and fearless, her hair loose in the wind. She hadn't used a rope, a whip, or even words. She had simply walked close, her hand out, her eyes steady. By the end of that afternoon, she was astride that horse's back, riding bear as if the two had been born together. It had been her gift, this unspoken language that went beyond training or technique. Some called it instinct, others a curse, for it gave her courage where others felt fear. John had admired it and worried about it in equal measure, and when she passed, leaving Lily in his care, he had feared that gift was gone with her. But today, watching Lily with Diablo, John realized it had not died. It had not vanished with Grace's laughter or her final breath. It had passed on, quietly, invisibly, into the small hands and wide eyes of the girl now asleep inside the ranch house. The way Lily had sat in the dirt, drawing pictures, whispering instead of shouting, waiting instead of demanding. It had all been Grace again, but with a child's innocence. The horse had not been broken. He had not been conquered. He had chosen her, the same way that other mustang had once chosen Grace. John rubbed his face with rough hands, sighing deep from the chest. The gossip in town still stung. Words like reckless, foolish, even dangerous, had been thrown at him all week. Men who had once respected him now questioned his judgment, and women muttered about child endangerment behind their hands. But those people hadn't seen what he saw. They hadn't seen the fire skip a generation, only to flare again in Lily. They didn't know that what she carried was not just luck, but legacy. The thought softened him. For so long, he had carried guilt for not protecting Grace from every hardship, guilt for the years when he had been too stern, too demanding. Watching Lily, he saw a chance to set things right, not by forcing her to follow his path, but by allowing her to follow her mother's. The bond with horses was not something he could explain or control, but it was something he could honor. And maybe, just maybe, it was something he could protect better this time. The stars came out one by one, pinpricks of light above the dark fields. From the barn, Diablo shifted in his stall, a low snort breaking the stillness. John leaned forward, listening, then smiled faintly. The horse no longer sounded angry. He sounded settled, as though even he knew that the fire and grace had not been lost, only passed on to new hands. John whispered into the night, almost ashamed of his own voice, "She's got your gift, Grace, and I won't let anyone take it from her." In that moment, the weight of doubt lifted, replaced by the quiet strength of knowing he was no longer just a grandfather raising a child. He was a guardian of a legacy, one restored in the unlikely pairing of a little girl and a wild mustang. The days after fair were unlike anything the ranch had ever seen. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid Diablo's pen now drove up the long dirt road, leaning against fence rails, their faces half in awe, half in disbelief. They wanted to see with their own eyes what they had heard whispered in town and shouted across the fairgrounds. The wild horse had bowed not to force, but to a little girl. John Carter found himself watching them from the porch, tipping his hat politely, while inside him the memory of jeers and accusations still echoed. For weeks they had called him reckless, said he was endangering Lily's life, insisted he had lost the good sense that age was supposed to bring. Now those same voices spoke softer, unsure, because what they had witnessed could not be explained away by stubbornness or luck. John replayed the sight over and over. Lily's tiny frame perched on Diablo's back, the mustang moving steady and smooth beneath her, not bucking, not resisting, but carrying her as though she were meant to be there. It was the sort of thing a man might dismiss as a dream if not for the dust still clinging to her dress, the handprint of neighbors pressed against the arena rails, and the sudden hush that had fallen over the crowd. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't a stunt. It was the unexplainable truth, revealed in broad daylight. The ranch hands who had laughed the loudest were the first to change their tune. They muttered apologies to John, though never too loudly, and watched Lily with a kind of cautious respect. A few tried to reason it out, suggesting the horse must have been secretly worked with when no one was watching, or that perhaps exhaustion had finally dulled his spirit. But John knew better. There had been no breaking, no submission. What had happened was something else entirely. A meeting of trust where fear once ruled. Lily never boasted, never claimed credit. She went about her days the same way she always had, finishing her schoolwork at the kitchen table, then slipping outside to sit by Diablo's stall, humming as she brushed his coat or simply resting against the wooden beams while he grazed. To her, nothing miraculous had happened at all. She spoke about Diablo as though he were simply her friend, a creature who needed someone to listen to him, someone to give him time. Her innocence made the achievement even more astonishing, for while cowboys with decades of experience had failed, a child who knew nothing of dominance or control had succeeded. The sheriff stopped by once more, his hat in his hands, no longer demanding the horse be put down. Instead, he stood awkwardly, his words fumbling, admitting he had never seen anything like it. He did not say he was wrong, but John caught the look in his eyes. A man humbled by something he could not control nor understand. Thomas Gray, the rancher who had tried to buy Diablo, came again too, offering even more money. This time John didn't even answer. He only glanced at Lily, who shook her head before returning to Diablo's side. That was answer enough. By the end of the season, people in town spoke of Diablo differently. He was no longer the devil horse, the killer that no man could tame. Instead, he was a story told at the diner, a lesson whispered to children about patience, kindness, and the strange power of believing where others had given up. Folks began to use words like miracle, though John resisted that. To him, it was not a miracle. It was a plain and simple truth, unbelievable only to those who had never seen what love and quiet courage could do. One evening, as the sun sank low and the fields glowed gold, John watched from the porch as Lily leaned against Diablo, her small hand resting on his neck, his great head bent low beside her. He thought of all the men who had tried with ropes, spurs, and whips, and how quickly they had failed. And then he thought of the little girl who had done none of those things, who had only waited, listened, and trusted. It was then he understood the real change was not just in the horse. It was in the people who saw them together and had to admit that what they had dismissed as impossible had, in fact, happened right before their eyes. What no cowboy, no trainer, no whip could achieve, an 8-year-old child had accomplished with nothing but patience and love. Diablo, once feared as a beast beyond saving, now stood as a living symbol of trust. A reminder that sometimes the hardest hearts are not conquered by force, but softened by kindness. And in that truth, John found peace, for it meant his granddaughter had not only inherited her mother's gift, but had carried it further, proving that the bond between a horse and a human could rewrite even the most stubborn of stories.